Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Judah and Lindsay, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. Precious Memories. By the time Lindsay Neuwirth finished cleaning the medium-sized 3-bedroom cottage she and her father now called home, her back was aching. Raising herself to her full height, she stretched her hands out as far as they could go and felt some measure of relief. She loved taking care of her father, but sometimes felt that maybe it was time for her to get a life of her own. But he was still very vulnerable, and she worried about him, had done so for a very long time, and that was the reason she'd put her teaching career on hold so as to take care of him. Having been a professor at the University of New Hampshire in Concord for over 30 years, he'd retired a year ago and decided that their holiday cottage would be their new home. He was now in the process of gathering information for a book that he wanted to write. Normally, all the housekeeping work was done by Mabel Campbell, who lived a block down the road from them. But for 2 days now, Mabel had been down with a serious bout of the flu. Peaches, her 21-year-old daughter, and who had been Lindsay's best friend forever, had come by earlier that morning to help with the laundry. She'd also wanted to help clean the house, but having a sick mother who hated being confined in any way was quite a challenge. "I can't leave Mama alone for too long," she told Lindsay as she waved goodbye, "or else I'll find her climbing the walls with frustration. Let me go and attend to her, and should I have some free time later in the day, I'll be by to help you fold the clothes we washed today." "You're such a lovely dear," Lindsay had said as she bid her farewell. She understood that Mabel could be very difficult. The middle-aged woman was normally very strong and active, and being confined must be driving her out of her mind, not to mention what it was doing to her daughter. And speaking of difficult parents, Lindsay went in search of her own and found him seated in the small gazebo behind the cottage, lost in thought and staring at nothing in particular. "Papa," she had to call him 3 times before he responded. "Would you like me to get you anything?" Anselm Neuwirth raised sad eyes, so much like his daughter's blue ones, and shook his head. "Not right now." "Pa, are you all right?" she asked, in a soft voice, feeling so much compassion for her father, for she knew he carried a lot of pain in his heart, and for the first time in years, her father shook his head. In the past, he would always say that he was all right even when she could clearly see that he wasn't. For him to finally admit that something was wrong meant that he'd reached the end of his endurance. "Oh, Pa, I'm right here and you can tell me anything. What's wrong?" "I miss her so much." His voice was raspy and thick with unshed tears. "I miss Janice so much, and right now, I'm feeling so sad and weary." Lindsay sat next to her father and rested her head on his shoulder. "I miss Mama too," she whispered. "She's been gone for 15 years now, but it feels just like yesterday when she left us. This was her favorite spot, and the 2 of you used to spend so much time out here just enjoying nature." Their holiday cottage, as it once had been before it became home, was situated on a small hill that overlooked the Merrimack River, a beautiful body of water that saw a lot of vessels going up and down all the way to Massachusetts and emptying itself into the Atlantic Ocean. Before the train tracks were laid out, this was a very popular means of travel between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Currently, it was mostly leisure boats taking tourists along the river and tugboats hauling logs of timbers that made up most of the traffic on the river. Still, it was just wonderful sitting beside her father and watching the ships and boats go by. Lindsay, I'm sorry that in the past years I've put so much on you. Pa, it's nothing. You've been stronger than me, and yet I'm the one who's supposed to take care of you, he sighed. Lindsay, I've been very selfish, and it's time you started thinking about your own future. Please forgive me for making you move to Raven Cove and shelving your own career. But I think you need to go back to teaching. Lindsay put a finger over her father's lips. Pa, I can go back to teaching whenever I want to, but right now, this is where I want to be. You didn't make me do anything that I didn't want to. I also needed a change, and coming down here is the best thing to have happened to the both of us. Now you're ready to write your book, and I'm happy to help. So no more talk about me leaving you. The time will come when I will be ready to do so, but not just yet, Pa. You're my blessing. And for the next hour, the two of them sat in silence surrounded by trees that were swaying gently in the mid-morning breeze. Her parents had planted these trees when they first bought the property from an old Indian man who had no descendants to leave it to. He was the last of the Mohawks, after the rest of the tribe was pushed west by pioneers. His family had retained their land because his great-grandfather had been friendly and welcoming to the pioneers, and they let them stay. The only thing that Arnold Brown, as he'd been named after his baptism, had asked for was that he would be buried on his ancestral land. Her parents had agreed to his request, and his tomb was at the end of the property. That was years ago, and sometimes Lindsay wished she had met the man, but by the time she was born, he'd been long dead. Her mother had also planted a garden of herbs, and when they were in Concord, it was Mabel Campbell who'd taken care of things. It was a rare, warm day in the fall for Raven Cove. Her father had been taking advantage of the sunshine after she sent him out of the house, so he wouldn't remain so cooped up inside. Lately, he'd taken to burying himself in his numerous journals, and she sometimes had to practically sit with him so he would eat. Her mother had been dead for 15 years now, but it seemed just like yesterday. One minute she'd been all right, then she started complaining of a headache and decided to go and lie down. When her father came back from the university and tried to wake her up, he soon realized that she had passed away in her sleep. Lindsay had just started middle school, and nobody expected that Anselm could manage to take care of her. But he had, and for the past 15 years, it had just been the two of them. As she grew up, Lindsay began noticing that her father had started becoming forgetful and became very concerned. She finished school and took 2 years of training as a teacher and worked for a year, but concern for her father overrode her desire to make a career for herself. So when he retired and decided to move to Raven Cove, she also resigned from her post and came to take care of him. It was her turn to care for the man who had sacrificed a lot so she could grow up healthy and happy. Many times over the years, she'd overheard family friends and even people in church wondering why her father had not remarried, especially because they thought she needed a mother. It had irked her at first, as she felt that everyone was forgetting her mother so soon, and for a few years, she was quite difficult. But then she grew up and started understanding that her father needed to stop worrying about her so he could start living again, and the one cared for had turned into the caregiver. Her father was still in his prime, and it was time for her to let him go, so he would also let her go. Now, as she sat beside her father, she knew that the only way the two of them would move on was if she cleared the house of what had belonged to her mother. Boxes and boxes of her various items lay in their small attic and others in the master bedroom. For 15 years, everything had remained the same, and it was as though the two of them expected her to come back home at any time. But it was time to do the right thing and help her father start living again, and then perhaps she would stop being so concerned about him. "Pa, it's getting cold, and I don't want you to come down with the flu like Mrs. Mabel. Let's get you inside the house, and I will make you some hot chocolate." "You're a good daughter, Lindsay." "Thank you for saying that, Pa." She helped him to his feet and then to the house. It took Lindsay 2 days to finally gather the strength to go through her mother's stuff, and she nearly had a breakdown in the process. The soft rosewater perfume that her mother had loved so much still lingered on the clothes which had been kept locked up in her closet for 15 years. Her mother had owned a lot of beautiful clothes, hats, handbags, and shoes which could be donated to the Goodwill store, but she realized that she couldn't do it alone. So she waited for Peaches to come by, for she was expecting her, and then asked her to help. I should have cleared the closet and drawers years ago, but I just couldn't do it. Keeping Mama's clothes was a way of telling myself that she'd only gone away on a journey and would eventually be back. Lindsay was holding one of her mother's soft shawls. It was made from cashmere wool and still looked new. Her father had brought it back from a visit to India just a few months before her death, and her mother had loved it. It was purple, and this was one of the things that she would be keeping for herself. But Mama is never coming back, and Pa and I have to stop living in the past. She wiped a tear away. Thank you for being here. These are so beautiful that even though they are 15 years old, they're still very stylish. Your mother had such good taste in everything. Peaches was trying on one of the many hats they'd removed from the closet. This particular one is just amazing. She was referring to a white felt hat with a wide brim and had a black ribbon tied around its base. It will go nicely with the new frock Mama bought me for church. Thank you for saying I could have it. Pick a few items that you like and then help me pack up the rest, Lindsay told her. Really? You don't mind me having them? Mama would have loved for people to be blessed by her clothes and all, but instead, I've left it too long and held on selfishly when I should have let go ages ago. She picked up a pretty blue hat with a wide white ribbon. I remember that she wore this one on the same morning she died. She was supposed to go and attend Mrs. Moffat's daughter's wedding and even got dressed for it. But then she started complaining of a headache. Because she didn't want Pa to worry, she said she was going to lie down for a little while, and I was to wake her up as soon as he got in, so they could go for the wedding. But Mama never woke up again. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Mama never woke up, no matter how hard Pa tried to shake her. Lindsay, I'm so sorry. Peaches put the hat back on the bed and moved closer to her friend. If this is too painful, we can do it another time. No. Lindsay shook her head with firm resolve. Let's do it today. This is long overdue and must be done. I managed to get Pa out of the house and down to the restaurant. With his work on the book, it won't be so easy to get him out of the way next time, and I have to take advantage of this time. Mrs. Hunter will take good care of him as I clear all this up. Won't he be annoyed when he finds that you've cleared out the closets and drawers? No. She had a smile that lit up her otherwise plain face. She'd always felt that her forehead was too wide, her lips too thin, and her brown eyes too large. I told Pa what I intended to do, and he was quite relieved that finally I was clearing everything out. Maybe he wanted to do it sooner, but was afraid of how I would react. Good, then let's get on with it. They worked quickly and efficiently, placing the items in 3 piles. Those Peaches would take, those Lindsay would keep, and the larger pile would be going to the Goodwill store. You're such a lovely person, Peaches. Lindsay sat back on her haunches when they were nearly done. It would have taken me so long to do all this, Not to mention the tears and all. It feels like getting rid of a part of my life and it hurts. But it had to be done, and thank you for being here with me. It's my pleasure. But I've also gained from all this. She pointed at her pile. Those beautiful things will keep me going for a long time. You should have taken more. That would be greed, Lindsay. I actually feel guilty for denying some woman in a shelter somewhere these lovely dresses and hats. You deserve them for helping me so much. Thank you so much. 3 years ago, Ma and I were in the same situation, and you were the one who helped us out. Losing Pa was so heartbreaking, and at times I thought my mother would go out of her mind. You were there for me when I had to clear out my father's stuff, and I'm here for you today. It's hard, but at the time Ma rested 15 years ago, Pa had his job at the University of New Hampshire in Concord and so buried himself in his work. You and your mom are the ones who took care of me whenever we came down here for holidays, no matter how brief they were. It was something to look forward to. I could never have gotten through otherwise. You're the sister I never had, and I really love you, Peaches. As do I. They hugged it out. Now let's clear this up before your father returns. Chapter 2. Looking for a place. The clerical work Judah Rusher did part-time for McGraw Law Firm saw him coming to town 3 afternoons a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. He usually arrived at around 2 and left when it was close to 5, being one of the last to leave. He was running a bit late today because he'd had to help out at home. Little Jacob and Amy, his 3-year-old nephew and 1-year-old niece respectively, were down with the flu at Abby. His sister-in-law was quite swamped. She'd been up the whole night taking care of them, and by morning she could barely raise a finger. They didn't have a housekeeper because Abby had all of them who were still living at home chip in with the chores, and this morning it had been his turn to prepare breakfast and clean the kitchen. Not that he minded helping out, because Abby was a wonderful woman. Apart from his mother, she was the second woman in his life that he really cared about. Of course, Kate, Beth, and Sophia, his other sisters. In-law could have helped out, but Abby didn't want to expose anyone outside the immediate household members to the flu. Besides, Beth had BD to take care of and being pregnant. They didn't want her to be exposed to the flu. That was a risk no one wanted to take. The same applied to Sophia, who was newly married and soon to be a mother. His oldest brother, who was also Abby's husband Jed, and his other brother Joshua, were away in Sacramento. They had left 2 days ago to bring in a fresh supply of timber and weren't expected back until later that evening. They could easily have purchased whatever timber and posts they needed from Joshua Rafford, who owned the only sawmill in Woodland, but there was bad blood between the two families. Joshua had married Beth, his French wife, who had been betrothed to Joshua Rafford. Her father had even gone as far as paying a hefty dowry for her. But miscommunication because she hadn't known much English when she first arrived led her to marrying Joshua Rusher instead. From that time, nearly 2 years ago, the two families steered clear of each other. So it was that when the Rushers needed timber, they had to travel all the way to Sacramento to get it. "Judah, you're late," were the first words out of Eliezer McGraw's mouth as soon as he set foot into the office. "It's very much unlike you to come late to work. I hope there's no trouble at home." "No, Mr. McGraw, there's no trouble, and I'm very sorry for being late. It won't happen again." From when he'd started working here a few months ago, Eliezer had told him that he didn't like long and unnecessary explanations about anything. So he didn't offer a reason as to why he was late. His boss merely grunted and handed him a thick folder. Inside here is Mr. Tom Wilkins's last will and testament, which I want you to go over with a fine eye and tell me if you find anything odd. The man is quite eccentric, and I want to make sure that we get it right. He keeps changing it every few months, and we have to keep up with his eccentricities. Yes, sir. Once Judah had ascertained that his boss wouldn't be needing him for anything else soon, he went to his own corner desk, feeling quite pleased that Mr. McGraw had started entrusting him with very important work. He also knew that it was because Eliezer had discovered that he was a very fast reader and could recall nearly everything he read, no matter how long the document was. The only other clerk who worked full-time at the law office was Eliezer's nephew, Trent. He was lazy but good-natured, and Judah liked him. A few minutes later, Eliezer left to see a client, and Trent walked, or rather dragged himself across the room and stood in front of Judah's desk. "What are you working on now?" "Mr. Wilkins's last will and testament." Judah looked up. "Didn't your uncle leave you some work to do? You know how upset he gets when he finds work not completed." "I know that, and I'll get to it in a moment, but I want to ask you a question." "Go ahead." Judah shut the file and leaned both elbows on the desk. "You look really troubled, and I hope it doesn't mean that you've made a mess of the work your uncle gave you." Then he thought he sounded condescending and immediately apologized. "Sorry, ignore that. Is it something that you need my help with?" "It's more advice and a listening ear that I need, Judah." He sighed. "It's all about Maddie." He pulled up a chair and sat down. "What am I going to do about Maddie?" "Who's Maddie?" "Ms. Magdalene Billows. The pretty girl with freckles, red hair, and green eyes who sings in the church choir?" "Yes, that's the one." "What about Maddie?" A telltale blush rose up Trent's neck, and Judah nodded. "You like her." It was more of a statement than a question, and Trent didn't deny it. "I'm in love with Maddie, and she with me, but her uncle terrifies me. Apart from being her guardian, he's also the deputy sheriff." "Are you talking about Deputy Sheriff Gaines?" "I don't think he's a bad person, but he just has no tolerance for crime, and as far as I know, you're not a criminal. Or is there something I should know about?" Judah was trying to lighten the mood. "Joke all you want, Judah, but one day your own turn to fall in love will come." Trent wagged a finger. "Deputy Gaines found me speaking with Maddie on Sunday after church and got really mad. I thought he was going to flay me with the horsewhip he carries on his belt." "Why?" "Gaines isn't known for violence, unless it's directed towards hardened criminals. Why would you think the man would whip you for no reason at all?" He said, "I'm a lazy, good-for-nothing bum who is sponging off my uncle, and that I'm not good enough to be talking to his niece." It hurt very much. Trent blinked rapidly. But he was right, and it's true. I'm lazy and perhaps not good enough for Maddie. "You're not lazy." Judah tried to make the other man feel better. "Maybe you just have your own way of doing things. And as for being good enough for Maddie, don't you think she has a mind of her own? Don't you think she has a mind of her own?" "Don't sell yourself short, Trent." "You're very kind to say that, but I know that when it comes to this work, I really am lazy. And all that is because I'm not cut out to be a lawyer. My mother was the one who insisted that her brother give me this job, and Uncle Eliezer did it just to get her off his back. Mama can nag until she gets her own way." "I thought you were doing all right." He chuckled at Trent's glance that told him he didn't believe a single word he was saying. "Okay then, what do you think you're good at?" "Working with my hands." A light suddenly came into Trent's eyes. "It all started on the first day Papa took me to Adam Cisney's workshop when I was 15. I saw him banging tools all around and making wonderful things from seemingly useless scrap metal." He waved his hands excitedly. reminding Judah of a bird that was preparing for flight. Right then, I knew that working with my hands as a blacksmith is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. If my father had lived, perhaps we wouldn't be having this conversation, but Mama doesn't believe in anything other than me becoming a lawyer after my uncle. You see, my grandfather and great-grandfather before him were all men of the law. Mama insists that it runs in the family. I sometimes wish I wasn't her only son, so she would give me a break. My 2 sisters are lucky and got married to men who took them out of Woodland, so I'm like the center of Mama's whole universe. Would you lend me 1 or 2 of your own brothers? Judah laughed out loud. Why not take all of them? But seriously, why haven't you ever told your uncle this? Because he'll be angry and think I'm a loser. Then he'll tell Mama, who will walk around with a long face, and both of them will end up making me feel so guilty. You have to think about your life and future. Trent, if you continue denying yourself the chance to do what you like and do what you like and do what you don't, you'll end up bitter and frustrated. It's not good for you, and it's also not fair to the clients that you have to serve. They need you to be there to defend them with your whole heart and mind, and not just halfway. I just wish there was a way I could get my uncle to see that I can do something else and be really good at it. Not necessarily law. But my mother, he shook his head. Judah didn't like getting into other people's personal business, but he knew that there was no way Trent would be able to stand up to his uncle. My sisters in-law would say that we should take all this to the Lord in prayer, and they would be right. Seek guidance and counsel from the Reverend and see what he says. Maddie and I have been praying that my uncle would listen to me. She knows my passion for blacksmith work and has been encouraging me to speak to Uncle Eliezer about it. But I just don't know what to do or how to make my uncle root for me with Mama. He turned an earnest face to Judah. My uncle respects and listens to you, Judah. Would you help me speak with him? Judah started shaking his head, then saw the crestfallen face and sighed. Your uncle listens to me when it comes to official work. I'm not sure that he would be willing to let me interfere with his family issues, and I might only make things worse for you. Already worse than they are right now. I don't think so. Please just try. All right then. But be prepared for your uncle to get really angry and give us both a ticking off. That's if we don't lose our jobs. Just as long as he understands what I want to do, the rest will work itself out. Thinking about Trent's plight later that night when he was in bed made Judah feel really blessed. Jed had brought him and his 5 brothers up to think for themselves and pursue their own dreams. He'd never once forced any of them into doing what they didn't like or weren't good at. Much as he expected them to all chip in when it came to the farm, he still let them go after their individual pursuits from time to time. Joshua, his second brother, was a hard worker, but very shy and reserved. Whenever someone needed any heavy work done, it was to Joshua that they turned to, and he never let anyone down. Built like an ox, he was strong and sturdy, but yet so gentle with his French wife, Beth, and their little girl, Bibi. They were expecting another child in a few months' time, and he'd spoken of starting his own construction company. Jed had supported him in the past even when there wasn't any extra money for him to get the equipment and tools he needed. Things were looking so much better now that they had their maternal grandfather's inheritance, which had come to them just a few weeks ago. At least right now, his brother could realize his dream, but even when there wasn't anything to spare, Jed had never once shut Joshua's dreams down. Jonathan, who loved hunting and was a fur trader, also received enough support from Jed to pursue his desire of becoming one of the best in the West. He and his wife Sophia were now in the process of starting their own tannery, and Jed had stood with them all the way. John was the engineer of the family and loved tinkering with equipment so as to make work and chores easy for everyone on the farm. Even when he'd seemed not to know what to do, Jed had urged him to work hard and never give up. Having just married his beloved Catherine a little over a year ago, he was in his element. Kate, as they all called her, was the only child and heiress of Fred Langer, who made the great engines that were currently running from east to west, nearly daily now. The two were busy traveling all over the country making sure Mr. Langer's work went on. But John always confessed that if Jed hadn't supported his dreams of becoming a great engineer, none of that would have been possible. Josiah and Jeremiah, who were younger than Judah and were also hard workers with different passions, though they all pulled together when anything needed to be done on the farm. Everyone did what they were best at, and their farm and home ran like one of John's well-oiled machines. Even he, as an avid reader and dreamer, he had never once been berated by Jed for loving books more than manual work. When he'd informed his brother that he wanted to work for some hours each week at a law office, it was Jed who'd suggested Eliezer McGraw and not any of the other 3 lawyers in Woodland. Jed believed that Eliezer was the only honest lawyer in Woodland, and he was right. Much as Eliezer was a stickler for precision, he was also a very fair and honest man. His clients never had to worry about not being represented well or being fleeced of their hard-earned income. But if Eliezer didn't find someone who shared his passion and had to continue depending on his nephew, he would soon begin to lose clients. The man had actually offered him a full-time position, but this wasn't his passion. He enjoyed what the law had to teach him, but he loved books more. Being among endless volumes of the written word was his delight, not sitting behind a desk for the rest of his life. Judah found himself pitying Trent, who had to do what he didn't like just to please his mother and uncle. He'd made a promise to intercede for Trent, and he found himself praying that he would have the right words to speak so as not to make the situation any worse. Thinking about Trent made him consider his own life. Watching his brothers fall in love and get married in the past few years made him think seriously about finding love. Lately, he'd been thinking about finding himself a good wife. But he also wasn't so desperate as to grab the first woman who came along. He needed someone who would understand him and his passion for books. With the little salary that Eliezer paid him, he'd started buying more books and with his inheritance, thought of opening a library in Woodland. He was still working out the modalities of doing all that, and the kind of wife he needed was one who wouldn't scorn at his love for books or think that he was wasting money on them. Ofttimes his own family didn't understand why he read so much, but he couldn't see an article without wanting to know what it was all about and analyze it. That was the knowledge he wanted to share with the rest of the world, but he needed a companion who would be his helpmeet in every sense of the word. His last thought before he fell asleep was that he would begin perusing the newspapers for adverts of women who were ready to come to the West as brides. He might just get lucky and get the right kind of woman who would be suitable for him. Chapter 3. Unusual Suggestion. Ta? Yes, child? Lindsay didn't know whether what she was going to propose to her father would be met with anger or acceptance, but she had to try. Her father had been sad for so long, and now it was time for him to find love and laughter again. What is it, Lindsay? Anselm stopped what he was doing to pay attention to his daughter. His reading glasses were perched at the edge of his nose, and Lindsay understood why he'd been one of the best professors while he was working. That piercing look was enough to make a student work hard to hand in all the assignments given. He'd been reading through some of the notes he had written over the months with regard to his research, and he placed those aside. Pa. She twisted her fingers nervously. It's just that you've been sad for a very long time, and I'd like for you to be happy again. I know that you miss Mama so much. For a while, your job at the university was your solace, but after retirement, I'm afraid that you're getting really depressed. The doctor said you have to avoid any incidents that could cause further damage to your heart. You stopped working because of your weak heart, and you need to keep healthy, which I'm afraid is not happening. I have my research, Anselm smiled gently at his daughter, taking his glasses off. She reminded him so much of his late wife. That keeps me very busy, and I have no time to fall into depression, so you don't have to worry about that. I know that, Pa. But what happens once you finish writing your book? Will you start looking for another project to complete and then another? And in the meantime, life is passing you by. Aren't you the one who is always reminding me that time once lost can never be recovered? What's so wrong with having projects to do? You need to live again, Pa. Running after more and more projects isn't living but merely surviving. Anselm chuckled, stretching his legs before him, but careful to keep them off the table, much as he was tempted to place them there. Mabel would have his hide if she found him using the glass-topped table as a footrest. I'm alive, he said. Do I look dead to you? Pa. Okay, girl, what's on your mind? Mrs. Mabel. Lindsay saw her father give a start, and then color crept up his neck. Pa, I have a feeling that you like her very much, and I know that she likes you too. She carefully observed his reaction to her words. He didn't seem angry, which encouraged her to go on. Pa, Peaches and I were talking, and we both feel that it would be wonderful for us to be sisters. Huh. The single word was loaded, and her father rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. And when did you two young ladies decide to interfere in the lives of your parents? Mrs. Mabel has been very lonely since her husband died 3 years ago, and Peaches is really worried about her like I worry about her, like I worry about you. You're both very lonely and sad, and that's not a good thing. What are you suggesting? The two of you enjoy each other's company, and you smile a lot when Mrs. Mabel is around, Pa, just like now. You can also hear her singing, something she doesn't do when she's at home. Pa, why don't you marry Mrs. Mabel? She's a good woman, and the two of you can then spend many years of companionship together. Anselm was silent for so long that Lindsay feared that she might have offended him. Then he sighed deeply. Do you really know what you're asking, Lindsay? Yes, Pa. A chance for you to fall in love with a good woman and spend the rest of your life with her. He nodded slightly and then once again put his glasses on and picked his papers up. That was his way of saying that the conversation was over, but Lindsay was hopeful. He hadn't gotten angry and dismissed her. She knew her father very well, and giving him space to ponder over her words was what she was going to do. He would tell her what he thought of her suggestion when he was good and ready. 2 days later, Lindsay heard her father calling her. She was in the kitchen, and he was seated at his favorite spot behind the house. Yes, Pa? I've been thinking a lot about what we spoke about the other day, he said once she was seated next to him, and I think I have 1 or 2 things to ask you. Yes, Pa? Are you sure you're not just pushing me to marry Mabel because you're tired of taking care of me? Pa, I would never get tired of looking after you. I love you and will continue to do so for the rest of my life, if need be. He chuckled softly and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. You're such a selfless girl, and I feel guilty keeping you here when you should be pursuing your own life. So I've decided that if you're happy about Mabel taking your mother's place, then I'll go ahead and propose to her. Pa, It's not that she will be taking Mama's place. She had to make that clear so her father wouldn't feel guilty about falling in love again. Ma would never have wanted you to go through life alone and sad. Mrs. Mabel is a good woman, and she will be a wonderful companion for you." "And you're sure about all this?" "Yes, I am." And she meant it from the bottom of her heart. Once Lindsay had assured her father that she was happy about him marrying Mabel, he quickly took matters into his own hands and proposed to her. 2 weeks later, they were married. The small church was nearly empty for the ceremony because they hadn't told many people about their wedding. Still, their close friends turned up, and that was all that mattered. A simple reception held in the Sunday school room in the church basement summarized the ceremony, and the two were now on their way to their honeymoon. Because of his love for cruises, Anselm had decided to take his new wife to Lake Winnipesaukee so they could sail on the MS Mount Washington, the largest steamer on the lake. It would only be a 1-week cruise, but the girls were happy to see their parents looking so excited about it. As Lindsay and Peaches walked back home after seeing their parents off at the stagecoach office, they were holding hands. "Sisters forever," Lindsay said. "Indeed. Indeed. While our parents are away on their honeymoon, why don't we take this time to move your stuff to our house? You and I will share a bedroom, and I'm just glad that we had the foresight to clear out all the closets and drawers so your mother can have a place to put her own things. Or if you like, we can clear out the 3rd bedroom of Pa's books and stuff so you can use it." "No, I'm happy to share a bedroom with you. To tell you the truth, I don't much like our house because it's so tiny. Your bedroom is bigger than our whole house." "Well, at least you don't have to go back there from today on. Our parents will be away for the next week, and by the time they come back, you'll be fully settled here in your new home. What will you do with your house?" Mama said she would be putting it up for rent as a holiday cottage. That should bring in some income in her lifetime. At least they have each other, and I pray they live together forever. Did you see how happy Mama was? It was as if the sun had risen in her life once again. My father was also so happy. I think they've been in love for a while but didn't know how we would react to that. Do you know what Pa told me last evening?" Peaches shook her head. That he was worried I would feel that he was trying to quickly replace Mama, and this after 15 years. I had to keep reassuring him that I was so happy about the whole idea of his getting married again. Mom and I had a long talk, as she asked me how I felt about her getting married again. I told her it was all right, but she kept asking me what you thought about it also. Lindsay sensed the unasked question. "Peaches, I was the one who asked my father to consider your mother as his life's companion, not because of anything else, but that it was the right thing for both of them to do. They've enjoyed each other's company for a long time, and it was about time it happened. Whenever Papa was in one of his black moods, it's only your mother who could get him out again. They are just right for each other, and I'm so happy about it so you can get all your worries out of your heart. Besides that, you and I are grown now and will soon be gone from home. Did you want your mother to remain alone in that house?" Peaches had a pensive look on her face. "Lindsay, do you think you and I will find such deep and abiding love as our parents had before and have found again?" "Why do you ask?" "It's just that around here, I don't see any young men who would make good husbands, at least not for the two of us. Most of those we know still live with their parents and are sort of tied to their mother's apron strings. Such men can never make good husbands." They had reached the house, and Lindsay unlocked the front door. "Your words are so dismal, Peaches. Surely there must be at least one person who can fit the position of a good husband among the young men we know. Don't just dismiss everyone. You and I are 23 and not growing any younger. Don't you ever wonder about the man who will marry you?" Lindsay nodded. "I've thought about it plenty of times in the past, but I also couldn't make any plans previously because of my father. I couldn't imagine getting married and moving to my husband's home and leaving Pia all alone. But now that I have gained a new mother, finding a husband is something I'll begin considering seriously. My problem is where you will find a good husband. I noticed that Mr. Thompson, the senior deacon at church, has been hovering around you a lot. Mama also noticed and said she would ask you what was going on, and his kids like you a lot." Lindsay shuddered. "He's closer to Pa's age than mine, and besides, I think he's just looking for a person to take care of his 4 children after his wife's death. I'm a teacher, and it's natural for children to like me. Peaches, but that doesn't mean that I'm attracted to their father. That's the sad thing about men waiting too long to marry. Mr. Thompson married when he was well into his 40s because he spent so many years out at sea. His poor wife was much younger than him, and she always looked so lonely. Some even say she died of a broken heart." "Really?" Peaches nodded. "They say that she fell in love with someone else, who promised to treat her well, but he was killed before they could run away together. After that, she just sort of withdrew into herself until the day she died." Peaches. "That's gossip, and probably not true. At least let the poor woman rest in peace, and not have her name tossed around with such allegations. I'm sorry, but I don't want you to get married to someone like that. Mr. Thompson is so cold and stern and would soon drive the laughter out of you, Lindsay. Well, you can rest easy because Mr. Thompson isn't the man for me." Lindsay angled her head, studying her new sister intently. "What do you think of me introducing him to Miss Gander, the organist? She's never been married before, and we always thought of her as a very rigid and unsmiling sort. It's a wonder that she plays the organ so well and brings out such beautiful music. They might just hit it off, and then Mr. Thompson can stop hovering around me, like you say. Frankly, I'd like someone who won't treat me just as his maid and housekeeper. Miss Gander was engaged to be married to some man years ago, but he eloped with her younger sister, and she's never moved on. And before you say that I'm gossiping, she told us all that during a Bible study class. If she's talking about it after all these years, then I think she's ready to move on. Go on and see if you can get those 2 to get married. You seem to be really good at matchmaking, if our parents are anything to go on. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Peaches. I'll work on getting another wedding happening soon, and then perhaps I can take a good look at my own life." They moved to the kitchen to prepare something to eat. They still had plenty of time before nightfall to go to Peaches' house and pack up their stuff. "How then do you intend to find a husband for yourself, Lindsay?" Lindsay wasn't sure what to answer her friend and so changed the topic, at least for the moment. But Peaches was right. It was about time that the 2 of them began seriously thinking about getting married. Their parents loved them, yes, but they needed to give them some privacy and space so they could build up their new marriage. Having 2 adult daughters living at home was probably the last thing the 2 of them needed, even though she was sure they would never show them anything other than love. "I was thinking," Lindsay said hours later when they had brought in the last of the boxes from the Campbell's place. They had already unpacked most of the stuff except Mabel's personal items, which they put in the master bedroom for her to do in her own time when she got back. They were enjoying a much-needed cup of tea as they waited for their dinner to be ready. "What?" Pa is currently researching on how mail-order brides from Europe and England landed in America, and more so, how they have helped build and settle the West. He wants to write a book on the true strength of the pioneer women. That sounds really interesting. I think so too, and that's why I've been helping him with his research, but feel that we're just barely scratching the surface of things. Pa is writing from the perspective of a man. What if I was able to get him information on how the women actually ended up as mail-order brides or pioneers of the Western frontier? What do you have in mind? Lindsay's response was to hold out some old newspapers that had been lying on top of the table in the living room. Going through these, I found some old advertisements dating from before the Civil War, which were placed by men in the West seeking wives and others from women who were ready to go out there as brides. These are so interesting because people believed that they could find love and make homes out there. And women left everything behind and went in search of something different from what they already knew. So, what if I went out to the West as a mail-order bride? I could then find and speak to many women like me and their families and write about their experiences, if they will let me. The best way of getting real information is by going to the actual source. That makes a lot of sense, but will your father let you go? You do realize that the West isn't a stone's throw away? With Mrs. Mabel here to take care of him, he won't worry about me too much. And if I'm able to convince him that it will be good for his book, Pa will allow me to go. Of course, there will be the usual hesitation and all, but I know that I can eventually convince him to see things from my point of view. You're very brave for even considering making such a move. I don't know if I have it in me to go so far away from home. I would be so scared that I wouldn't fit in with the people out there. Well, once I get there and settle down, I'll be sure to invite you to come and visit. Who knows, you might just end up liking the West and decide to settle down there too. A person never knows the strength and courage they possess within themselves until they're in a situation that requires them to stand strong. Never doubt yourself, Peaches. What about our parents? Who will take care of them? Should I also come to join you out there? They now have each other, and that won't be a problem. I'll search for a good husband for you also so we can always be together. Neighbors, perhaps. They giggled like schoolgirls. Just think, you and I could have our babies born at the same time and growing up together. That sounds like a big dream, but I like your optimism. Chapter 4. His Intended Bride. After months of teasing his brothers mercilessly about turning into big goofs after meeting their brides, Judah was shy about telling them that his own intended was on her way to Woodland. Would they consider him a fool for having invited Miss Lindsay Neuwirth? After exchanging only 2 letters with her, they hadn't even sent each other pictures, each saying they would like to be surprised when the time came for them to meet. But Joshua had married Beth immediately after she stepped off the train, even though he'd never met her before. John had proposed to Catherine within days of their meeting. Jonathan had fallen in love with an unconscious woman, and even Jed himself had married Abby the same day he met her. Though in Jed's case, he and Abby had at least corresponded a few times. Who were they to judge him when all 4 of them were as guilty as he was? His brothers shouldn't cast stones at him, he argued as he walked to the church for Trent and Magdalene's wedding, which was finally happening. Just as he'd promised, he'd stood beside Trent as he made his case before his uncle. Even though Eliezer McGraw grunted and scowled to express his displeasure, he'd later admitted to Judah that he was proud of his nephew. He said that he'd always known that Trent was more of a manual labor man than a suit-and-tie kind of person. It was clear that he finally respected the young man, and Judah was happy for his friend. He'd also stood up to his sister and convinced her to give the boy a chance to be happy, and she'd done so grudgingly. Trent was now an apprentice with Adam Sisney and his uncle, had promised to support him until he was able to stand on his own 2 feet again, as long as he worked hard. With his enthusiasm and zeal, Judah knew that Trent would be a wonderful blacksmith. What made matters even better was that Eliezer had met with Deputy Gaines and spoken for his sister's son, and the gruff law enforcement officer had given his consent for the wedding to take place. Now the two were about to wed, and it was clear that they were deeply in love. It made Judah envy their happiness, especially since Maddie supported Trent's passion and dream. Their relationship was one of the reasons Judah had sent in his own advertisement for a mail-order bride through the Woodland Herald, and Hugo Grant hadn't disappointed him. Lindsay Neuwirth of Raven Cove in New Hampshire had won his heart, or rather his head, with her writing. She'd mentioned that she was trained as a middle school teacher and was carrying out some research for her father, but promised that she wouldn't let that interfere with her role as a wife and mother when the time came. A woman can be a homemaker and also pursue a career as long as her husband understands this and is willing to support her, she'd written. As a teacher, I always urged my female students to try and excel in everything they did, even though they were still very young. Changing the mindset of young girls goes a long way in ensuring they know that they also have a role to play and a destiny to fulfill in as far as building this great country goes. This isn't the century and era in time when all they have to look forward to is marriage and having babies, even though that is a great blessing too. There's so much that enlightened women who also honor their godly roles as wives and mothers have to offer their husbands, community, and even the whole world. Her intelligence was what had won him over, and he tossed all the other letters he had received alongside hers into the bin. That was her first letter to him, and by the second one, he'd known that Lindsay Neuwirth was the right woman for him. She spoke his kind of language, and a woman who thought about advancing her career ought to be a joy to have around the home. Their children would have the best from both of them, and he couldn't help smiling as he watched Trent and Maddie exchanging their vows, even though he couldn't for the life of him tell what had been preached. The wedding ceremony soon ended, and he waved at his brothers and their wives, who'd also been invited. He didn't want to wait around to join the blissful couple as they took photographs on the steps of the church. Photography had come a long way, and now more than ever, people wanted their memories printed out for them to store for generations to come. While he didn't begrudge the newlyweds the time they intended to spend making memories of the beginning of their life together, he had to be somewhere else. Later, everyone would move to Eliezer's home for a big reception, but Judah doubted that he would be able to attend. Lindsay's train was about 2 hours away, and he wanted to be right there at the station to meet her. With nearly half the male population in Woodland being single, he didn't want to make the same mistake Joshua Rafford had and lost Beth to his own brother by not being there in person to receive his bride. As he made his way to the train station, which had now been fenced off for the safety of the residents of the town, and especially children, he noticed a number of young men hanging around there. Some had been in church for the wedding, but they now seemed to have agendas of their own. Waiting for the train meant some were here to meet their brides, while others were hopeful of finding some woman who'd been abandoned and convincing her that they were good enough to marry. It had happened a number of times before, and he felt something like pity for men who prowled the station in order to find their mates. Why they didn't advertise for prospective brides was something he didn't understand, but perhaps they didn't mind getting any woman who was willing to go with them. Not him. He had sought the perfect mate and found her, and he smiled and even nearly broke into a whistle. Once Lindsay and he were settled in their new home, he would invite Hugo for dinner, because it was through his magazine that he'd found his bride. The world looked so bright, as did the future, and Judah didn't realize that he was smiling at everyone until he started getting odd looks from strangers too. A few acquaintances hailed him and he waved back but kept walking up and down the platform as he waited for the train. He rather envied Trent, who was now married and probably already celebrating his nuptials with one of Beth's beautiful pastry creations. Judah was sure that if he'd told his family that he was getting married today as soon as Lindsay got off the train, a cake would have been waiting at home for them too. But that wasn't going to be. He'd chosen to do things in this manner, so he was going to have to live with the decision. But no one was taking his bride away from him. Of that, he was determined. He had spoken with Jed about building himself a house, though he hadn't mentioned that Lindsay was on the way. His brother just thought he was preparing himself for the future, when actually he was about to get married, and today too. He wondered what Trent would think about all that. No doubt his own wedding would be small and quiet, unlike the fun fair that was going on right now. Through the station fence, he could see people getting into their buggies and wagons and heading towards Eliezer's home. The man had a wife who was a wonderful hostess, and Judah had no doubt that there would be plenty to eat and drink, not to mention the fact that Trent's own mother would want to show the world that she was as good a hostess as her sister-in-law. He even saw Hugo posting an advert on the station's notice board and waved at him, though he hoped he wouldn't come over. He sighed in relief when the newspaper man simply waved back and then left. The train was right on time, and Lindsay wiped her hands on her long skirt. It had belonged to her mother, and Peaches had helped tuck in the sides and let down the hem to make it fit because she was slender and taller than her mother had been. A little tucking here and folding there, and it was good to go. She hoped that she looked presentable enough because Judah Rusher had made it clear that they were getting married as soon as she set foot in Woodland. She was both excited and nervous, for she didn't know what her future husband would think when he saw her. In the 2 letters they'd exchanged on each side, neither of them had wanted to enclose a photograph, so she was in the dark as to the man who would be waiting to make her his wife. What if he didn't like her, or what if she didn't find him suitable? Would they go ahead with the wedding, or would they want to wait until they were sure? Peaches had suggested that she wear one of her mother's frilly dresses with lace for her wedding, but that wasn't her style at all. She was more conservative and felt that the long tweed skirt and its matching jacket would do very well. The only concession was the frilly white blouse she had on, and the white hat with a small veil at the front. "Well, here goes," she said as she stepped off the train and looked around. People seemed to be rushing around in every direction, and she moved out of the path of a clearly impatient young man who seemed to be searching for someone. It was interesting to watch as young ladies of all ages stepped off the train and into the waiting arms of their future husbands. For a moment, Lindsay forgot about her own reasons for being in Woodland and pulled her notebook out of her purse. She'd started making small notes right from the moment her whole family escorted her to the station, back in Raven Cove to catch her train. Just like she'd predicted, at first her father had been reluctant to let her go, but the 3 of them convinced him, and he'd given her his blessing. But if that man mistreats you in any way, just write to me, and I'll be there on the first train out. No man is going to ill-treat any of my daughters. He said this while looking at Lindsay and Peaches. You deserve good men, and if it wasn't that you're doing this for research, I wouldn't have let you go. On the train, she'd had the opportunity of speaking with a number of women who, like her, were traveling to different parts of the West as mail-order brides. Even though Judah Rusher had sent her enough money for an upper second-class compartment, she'd chosen to use the third-class coach, where many of the young women were so she could carry out her research. As a teacher, she knew that in order to get the best out of her students, she had to come down to their level and make them feel that she was one of them. And adults were no different. Had she been in the second-class coach, none of the women would have felt as free to share their stories. Sitting in the crowded coach with them made them feel like she was one of them, and so they opened up to her with their stories. She had notes from over 20 women, and that was a good start. One thing that came out very clearly after speaking with all of them was that they were all very brave and courageous indeed. Leaving their homes for the unknown had to take courage, though a number were doing it to escape worse situations at home. Between marrying a man I've never met before and becoming a lecherous man's mistress, the former is the lesser evil and a better option, one lady called Kate Winslow had shared. From the nods of a few other ladies, Lindsay knew many more were running away from such a life of being degraded simply because they were women. She hailed them for not giving in to such illicit relationships. She'd gone a step further and taken the addresses of those who were willing to share them and promised to write to them and perhaps visit them just to see how they were doing. It had all been done on the spur of the moment, but now she wondered if Judah Rusher would ever let her leave home once they got married. What if he wanted her to remain at home taking care of him? But she'd been honest enough to tell him that she intended on pursuing her career and hoped he wouldn't be the kind of man who said one thing but did the other. A double-minded man could never be trusted. So engrossed was she in what she was writing about that she didn't notice the man who'd been observing her for a while. Her interest was caught up in watching many young ladies meeting their future husbands for the first time and their different reactions, and she had a smile on her face. It felt so romantic, especially given that most of them had expressed so much fear on the train. She gave a start when a man suddenly appeared before her. With a small cry, she dropped her notebook. "I'm sorry," he said, and they both bent down to retrieve the book. Their foreheads connected painfully, and Lindsay thought she saw stars. She would have fallen backwards if strong arms hadn't held her by the shoulders and steadied her, helping her to rise to her feet. He didn't immediately let go, and she couldn't explain what she was feeling. "Are you all right?" Judah couldn't believe how clumsy he'd been. After watching the various women as they disembarked from the train and into the arms of his peers, he'd seen this particular one standing alone and writing in her notebook, and immediately guessed that it was Lindsay Neuwirth, his intended. "I'll be all right in a while," Lindsay said, quite winded after the knock to her forehead. The man's forehead was as hard as flint, and she prayed that her brain wasn't dislodged. Then she bit back a giggle. It was quite obvious that she was giddy, and she couldn't tell if it was because of the blow to her head or because of the handsome man who still had his hands on her shoulders. He smelled like the earth, and she wondered where that thought had sprung from. "But I feel a little ill," she finally admitted, which was very true. Judah noticed that Lindsay, for this had to be her, was looking very pale and led her to a small stone bench just a few feet away. "Sit here for a while," he said. Then he noticed the lone trunk on the platform just as the train's whistle signaling its departure went off. It was one of the Langer engines that John was now in charge of, but his brother wasn't on this particular one. He'd asked the station master, who told him that John was in Chicago right now. "Is that your trunk?" "Yes," Lindsay managed to say, shutting her eyes tightly and praying that she wouldn't be sick all over the floor of the train platform. What kind of a bride would she be if the first thing her future husband had to do was take care of her as she threw up? She was fighting off the bout of nausea and dizziness when she remembered that it had been a while since she'd last eaten. So busy had she been collecting information for her father's research that she'd forgotten to eat anything. "You don't look all right," Judah muttered as he returned with her trunk, carrying it as if it weighed nothing, and she opened her eyes briefly. Noting how strong his hands were, she quickly shut them again and bit back a groan. Judah felt slightly irritated with Lindsay, for he'd confirmed her identity from the tag on her trunk. In comparison to his brother's wives, who were dazzling beauties, Lindsay was rather plain. Her forehead was broad and hard, and he unconsciously raised a hand to rub his own, which was still smarting from their rather unpleasant encounter. He muttered something unintelligible under his breath. "Did you say something?" Lindsay asked, eyes still shut, so she didn't see the look of annoyance that flashed across Judah's face, but she sensed that she hadn't made a good impression on him either. What woman is so clumsy as to butt heads with the man who was supposed to be her husband? For goodness sake! But it was all an accident, and he shouldn't sound so angry, she thought. "I have to take you home," Judah announced. He couldn't just leave her here on the platform at the train station, even though he wasn't ready to marry her. She just wasn't the kind of woman he'd been hoping for. "It looks like it might start raining soon, and I don't want us to be caught up in it. The road can be slippery, and I came with a small buggy, which isn't strong enough to withstand adverse weather conditions." "Come," he started turning away, and her heart sank. She opened her eyes and caught the scowl on his face before he wiped it away. This was no happy groom, and he didn't seem excited to see her or even ready to marry her, for there was no mention of passing by the church or the justice of the peace's chambers for such a ceremony. "Let's be on our way now, shall we?" Lindsay wanted to ask Judah about the wedding plans they'd made, but something in his voice told her that it wasn't a good time to do so. He was angry for some reason, and she was tired, hungry, and had a headache. "All right then," she said docilely, and let him precede her. He was carrying her trunk, and she tried to keep up with his long strides. Just before they left the station, one of the ladies she'd met on the train, called Marigold Flint, came running towards her. "Lindsay, Tim and I are off to the church to get married," she announced. Her eyes were glowing with happiness, and Lindsay found herself envying her. "Will you and your fiancé be joining us there? There are quite a number of us headed in that direction." Lindsay stole a glance at Judah, saw his stony expression, and sighed inwardly. "Later. We have to take care of something first. I wish you all the joys of wedded bliss," she said, as Marigold left to join her impatient fiancé. She wanted to cry, but strengthened herself with the thought that all wasn't lost. At least she was here to continue with her research. Then she stopped abruptly and tightened her lips. Why was she letting this man dictate her movements when it was clear he wasn't going to be her husband? What did she know about him, apart from the fact that he had mentioned in his letters that he lived on a farm with his brothers and also worked part-time at a law office? Who was he, and why should she follow him? "Wait," she called out in a strong voice, and Judah was forced to stop. "Put my trunk down and go your way." "What did you say?" "I said, put my trunk down and go your own way." "You don't really mean that." "Oh, but I do. When you invited me to Woodland, it was with the understanding that you and I would get married as soon as I got here. But clearly that's not going to happen today or any other day for that matter, and our relationship, if it can be called that, ends right here. Go your way, Mr. Judah. Rusher and I wish you well." Judah was stunned at Lindsay's words. Why had he thought of her as a docile and helpless female? "I can't just leave you here at the station. You're new in this town and something might happen to you." "Don't worry your head, sir. I'm a grown woman and can take care of myself. Thank you for bringing me this far, and I can take it from here." She walked up to him and tried to take the trunk from him. There was one thing that his parents and then Jed had instilled in him, and that was a strong sense of responsibility. Much as he was tempted to leave Lindsay at the station to fend for herself, as she was insisting, the thought of anyone saying that a rusher had brought a mail-order bride to Woodland and then abandoned her at the station was appalling. He would never be at peace with himself, and neither would his brothers ever forgive him when they found out. And what was worse, Abby would not let the matter rest. "Listen." He placed the trunk on the ground and then turned to face her. "I know that you're disappointed with whatever is going on, but I'm taking you home with me, and there's no arguing about that. I invited you here to Woodland, and it's my obligation to see that you're safe. We'll go home, and once there, you can then decide to move away or do whatever you want, but it will never be said that a rusher shirked on his duties. So no more arguing, and if you want to cause a scene, then I'll give you one. We're going to the farm, and after that, you can leave whenever you want. No one will stop you." He looked at her, eyes flashing at her. Lindsay thought about arguing, then decided that she didn't want to cause a scene. Like the man said, she could leave any time she wanted once she was on the farm. Besides that, she was hungry, tired, and had a headache that was threatening to blow up. She could always find herself another place to stay the next day, but for today, she would accept Judah Rusher's hospitality. Never mind the fact that it had been offered grudgingly. "Very well then, lead the way to your farm," she said, and stood waiting for him to carry on. When he was sure that she wouldn't try to slip away, he nodded and then picked the trunk up, and they resumed their journey. Not a single word was exchanged between them on the way to the farm, and it was with much relief that Lindsay saw the large sign over the gate that announced their arrival at their destination. Chapter 5. Rejected Bride. Jeremiah snickered when he saw Judah helping a woman down from the new family buggy. Though the body had been designed and forged by Adam Cisney, the machinations had been done by John, and it was turning heads with its capacity for speed. It was one of 4 that Jed had commissioned Adam and John to make. The other 3 were parked at the back of the barn after the rest of the family had returned from Trent and Maddie's wedding reception at Eliezer's home. "What is it with the boys of this family?" He asked no one in particular, but his voice carried to Judah. "People go to town on certain errands and end up returning here with brides. What is wrong with you rushers? You seem to rush into things just as your name implies." His older brothers all glared at him, and he felt his face redden when Lindsay raised her eyes and met his. She wondered who all these people were, but from the way they all looked so much alike, she guessed that they were Judah's brothers. They still hadn't formally introduced themselves, and on the way over, a small part of her brain had hoped that it was all a mistake and that the sullen man wasn't Judah, but she'd just been deceiving herself, and hearing the young man mentioning the family name drove the last nail in. This was the Rusher homestead, and the scowling man was Judah, no doubt. He had sounded so different in his letters, but meeting the real person made her wish she hadn't come. Judah saw Jed coming down the porch steps and reached for the large trunk, which was in the luggage holder at the back of the buggy. He braced himself for the questions he knew would be coming, but apart from a slightly raised eyebrow, Jed said nothing else. Maybe the reason Jed didn't demand answers from him immediately was because Abby was standing on the porch watching them, but Judah knew that he was far from being off the hook. Lindsay saw a tall man approaching, and at first thought it was Judah's father, but when he drew closer, she saw that he was just a few years older than her. He didn't seem like someone who normally spoke much, but she noticed the slightly raised eyebrow and felt that there was something going on that she didn't know about. After he helped Judah place her trunk on the ground, he walked over to her and held his hand out. "Welcome to the Rusher farm," he said. "My name is Jedediah Rusher, but everyone calls me Jed." That, he pointed at a little boy who was running very fast in their direction, "is my firstborn son, Jacob. Come, let me introduce you to everyone else." Lindsay was relieved that at least someone was speaking to her. It had been a long and silent ride, and much as she'd longed to ask questions on the way over, she'd held her peace. If a man didn't want to speak with her, there was no need of forcing him to do so. At some point, she even began wishing that she hadn't come, but then told herself that she would carry out her research and return to New Hampshire. Thank you. I'm Lindsay Neuwirth, and you have a lovely home. She saw Jed's lips twitching and wondered if she'd said something wrong. He seemed amused, but before she could ask him anything, the little boy was pulling at her skirt. She bent down until she was at eye level with him and gave him a gentle smile. He was just adorable. Hello. What's your name? Jacob, and this is my papa. He pointed at Jed. It was obvious that the boy was so proud of his parent, and she turned her head to look at Judah before turning back to Jed. May I hold him? Knock yourself out, Jed said with a short laugh. Ever since the baby came, Jacob has been making friends with everyone and anyone so they can carry him, since that honor now belongs to Amy. Thank you. Lindsay took the child in her arms, and he gave a whoop of joy. Turned to give Judah a look that caught Jed's eye before turning towards the porch. Judah couldn't interpret the look Lindsay gave him, but he'd heard her clearly and firmly giving Jed her name, an indication that the surname hadn't changed. She was making it clear that they weren't married, and it irked him. He should be the one telling his family that he wasn't yet married, not her. You've met Jacob. Now come and meet my wife and our little girl. Don't feel daunted at the fact that there are so many people around. This actually isn't all of us, but you'll eventually get to meet everyone else. Lindsay counted 2 other brothers and 2 women standing on the porch and followed Jed, ignoring Judah, who was coming up behind her with the trunk. He passed straight into the house, and the only other sign of displeasure she saw Jed giving his brother was the tightening of his lips. Miss Neuwirth, meet my lovely wife, Abby, and the little squirming bundle at her feet is Amy. She's teething and very fussy. You can put the boy down so you don't get tired. Lindsay loved children, but Jacob was heavy, and she was relieved to place him on the floor, where he immediately went down on his knees to play with his sister. One by one, Lindsay met Judah's family and was surprised when the 2 women hugged her. The second woman was introduced as Beth, Joshua's wife. She immediately felt at home, and to her surprise, Amy also crawled over and held her hands up, signifying that she wanted to be carried. She met Jeremiah and Joshua, who seemed like nice people. She likes you, Beth said, and Lindsay detected a French accent. She doesn't take too easily to strangers. She's really beautiful. May I hold her? Of course, Abby said, clearly the proud mother. Thank you. And she bent down to pick up Amy, who gave a sigh and instantly fell asleep. She's sleeping. You're a lifesaver. Abby led the way into the house. She's teething, and it's been really rough for her these past couple of days. If you don't mind, would you hold her as she sleeps, because as soon as I place her on the bed, she'll be awake, and the fussing will start all over again. She indicated the large couch. Please sit down before her weight sinks you to the ground. I'll just bring you some tea. Thank you, and I don't mind holding Amy. It actually felt good holding a little child, and Lindsay quashed her own desires. She'd believed that she would get married as soon as she got here, and in a few months have a baby of her own. That clearly wasn't going to be happening anytime soon. If Judah had all but ignored her on the way here, his family more than made up for it. They were so caring towards her, and she suddenly felt weary and filled with despair. This would have been her family if only Judah had kept his word. But they weren't, and she was going to have to leave the farm, she told herself, so that she wouldn't get attached to anyone. Of Judah there wasn't a sign, and she wondered where he'd disappeared to with her trunk. So how was he going to explain her presence in this house if he wasn't even speaking to her? Judah knew that his family members were all puzzled at his strange behavior. He stood in the bedroom, which he'd had to himself ever since John and Jonathan moved out of the house. Without letting anyone know, he'd prepared it as his bridal chamber, but now Lindsay would use it alone, at least for the moment. He had no idea how long she would want to stay, but from the way she demanded that he walk away from her, he knew she was probably already plotting how to leave the farm. Why had he brought her here in the first place? He should have taken her to a hotel and maybe paid for her accommodation for the duration of her stay in Woodland. After all, he was the reason she'd left her family behind and come all the way, so he owed her that much. But he'd brought her home, and any time now, he would be facing a lot of questions from the people downstairs. Life was complex, and he didn't know how he was going to solve this problem without hurting Lindsay. He'd seen the hurt in her eyes once she realized that they weren't getting married, but she'd quickly masked it and presented an indifferent face. She was probably used to hiding her pain and emotions, and he felt badly that he was the one who was the cause of her latest anguish. But he had to be true to himself, and not going ahead with the marriage was the right thing to do. Or was it? He quickly packed some of his clothes in a small bag because he had to make room for Lindsay. He would either squeeze into Josiah and Jeremiah's room, or else he would have to use the bunkhouse with the other workers. The only thing he disliked about the latter arrangement were the questions and funny looks he'd be getting for the unforeseeable future. Not that Josiah and Jeremiah would spare him either, but them he could deal with. And if his stern warnings didn't work, a few well-timed blows would get them to stay off his back. As he was thinking about what he was going to tell his family and how he would explain Lindsay's presence in their home as an uninvited guest, the door opened and Jed walked in. Joshua and Jeremiah followed closely behind, and they made themselves comfortable, as if they intended on staying for a while. "That was rather rude of you," Jed started, and Judah held his hand up. "This just isn't the time for all your questions, Jed." "It's exactly the right time." Jed used the firm tone that had worked on all the boys in the past. "This morning when you left home, you were going to attend Trent's wedding. We even saw you there, and you were alone. Then the next thing we know, you have brought a woman back here without any kind of explanation. And she looks like she's here to stay for a while, given her heavy trunk. Don't you think you at least owe us some kind of explanation? Respect for your family demands that you let us know what is going on if we're to open our home to a total stranger." Then Jed gave him a piercing look. "I hope you didn't take away another man's fiancé. Josh, no offense intended." "None taken," Joshua grinned. "Clearly a happily married man. My own case is very different from this particular one. At least I married the woman and brought her back here as a bride. What's more, she and I fell in love, and we're very happy together, so, dear brother, I take no offense at any words you may cast my way." For Joshua, that was a very long sentence, and if the mood wasn't so solemn, Judah would have teased him about it. But this wasn't the time for banter. "Judah, at least tell us who she is and why she's here." Jed's voice had softened. "We need to prepare ourselves for any eventualities like her family or an irate fiancé showing up here. Don't worry, Lindsay is here at my invitation." "As who and in what capacity?" "We were to get married," he mumbled. "But from the way the two of you are behaving and her emphasis on her surname when she introduced herself, it's clear that the two of you didn't make it as far as the church to get married. And looking at this room, it's clear that you had turned it into a love nest for the two of you. What exactly happened and what went wrong that you didn't get married, Judah?" "I thought I would be getting married today, but I changed my mind once I saw her," Judah said, ignoring the frowns on his brothers' faces, especially Jed and Josh. "Isn't it better not to rush into marriage than to do so in haste and then regret it afterwards?" "What's wrong with Lindsay?" Jeremiah was clearly puzzled. "She's really pretty and her eyes speak of great intelligence. Or were you hoping for a dumb blonde? One who won't ask any questions but will bend over backwards to please you?" He made a sound of disgust. "For a man who reads so much, you're really dumb, Judah." "Just shut up." Judah felt cross at being cornered by his brothers. "Is it wrong for me to change my mind? Besides, she's not what I expected." "And pray, dear brother, what were you expecting?" Jed raised an eyebrow. "The Queen of England, perchance?" "She's not beautiful." Judah blurted out and then turned quite red when his three brothers all glared at him. "She has a wide forehead. Her eyes are too close together and her lips are too thin." "Are you buying a horse or marrying a wife?" Jed had clearly had enough. "Wow, like Jeremiah says, you're really dumb." "I don't believe you said those words, and I'll pretend that I didn't hear them coming out of your mouth until you are in your right mind. Or else you're intoxicated, and I'll wait for the wine to drain out of your head before I ask you any more questions." Jed's voice was full of disappointment as he left the room shaking his head, which made Judah feel really bad. He could take Jed's anger any day, but not the thought that he'd let him down. But he argued within himself that he was only being honest, and at the end of the day, wasn't that the right thing to do? "I would never have taken you for one so fickle, Judah. But this is your life." That's all I have to say about this matter for now, and Joshua also left the bedroom. Judah glared at Jeremiah, who didn't seem in a hurry to leave like the other two. What? When he saw him looking at him with something akin to pity in his eyes. "Aren't you going to express your displeasure at my terrible actions? Your brothers just did, and now it's your chance to do the same." Jeremiah shook his head, straightening the quilt on the large bed. "As Jed says, it's your life and your decision. I'll add. But just so you know, there are some men who would snap up the chance to marry Lindsay. When you're done comparing her to all the other so-called beautiful women, I hope it won't be too late for you. Be sure that you're losing a good, and I hope it stings when you finally sober up. How would you know that she's a good woman? Amy doesn't just take to anyone, and neither does Jacob for that matter." "Well, I've said my own and will be going now." Jeremiah walked to the door. "Keep enjoying your loneliness." After his brothers left, he sat on the bed and held his head in his hands. Had he done the right thing in rejecting Lindsay merely for her looks? Was he fickle like his brothers thought him to be? Knowing that he wouldn't get any answers by hiding himself away, he decided to return to the living room and slip out of the house unnoticed. More questions would be dealt with later, and he knew that Abby was waiting for her own chance to find out more from him. Judah nearly went back upstairs when he realized that Lindsay was alone in the living room. Then he silently berated himself. He was a grown man and didn't need to skulk around like someone who was guilty of something. He was only being true to himself. So shrugging, he stepped into the room and cleared his throat softly. Lindsay immediately sensed when Judah returned to the room. She pretended to be concentrating on the sleeping child in her arms and ignored him. Beth had gone back to her own house while Abby was in the kitchen. The other brothers had returned from upstairs, where they'd followed Judah and each left without saying a further word to her. "Lindsay, I'm very sorry that things turned out this way," He felt compelled to tell her, but she didn't as much as acknowledge that she'd hurt him, and after an awkward few minutes, he walked out of the house. That's when she let out her breath and felt grateful that no one else had been in the room. She didn't want anyone looking at her with pity in their eyes. Judah Rusher had humiliated her before his family, and she was really angry. But she would hold her emotions in check until she was away, and then she would vent. For now, she was just glad that she had a place to sleep for tonight, and from the delicious aroma coming from the kitchen, a meal was on the way. Chapter 6. Rejected and Dejected. On the second day, when Lindsay mentioned that she had to leave, she didn't know that she'd stirred up a hornet's nest. Abby looked like she would swallow someone whole, and it amused Lindsay to see the tiny woman looking larger than life. Even her own husband, who was in the kitchen when she came in to tell her hostess that she wanted to leave, took one look at his wife's face and just disappeared through the back door. "What do you mean you're leaving, and where are you going to?" Abby demanded as they prepared breakfast together. She decided to tell her the truth. "I came here with hopes of getting married to Judah because he asked me to come. He'd even mentioned in the last letter that he sent me that we would get married as soon as I stepped off the train. But to my surprise, he changed his mind right at the station and didn't give me any kind of explanation. I even asked him to leave me in town so I could find my own accommodation, but he refused and insisted on bringing me out here. I don't understand why he did that. And since I'll never be a member of this family, I have to go." She deliberately kept her face away from Abby because she'd wept for a long time last night when she went to bed and her eyes were swollen. Never in her whole life had she felt so rejected and abandoned. "Miss Lindsay Neuwirth, I'll have none of that nonsense now. Do you hear me? You're our guest in this home for as long as possible, and no one will say otherwise. Do you have somewhere else to be?" Lindsay shook her head. "Before I came here, I wrote to Judah and informed him that I would be conducting some research for my father. Now that all this has happened, I guess I'll just have to find my way back to New Hampshire." Abby observed her for a brief moment. "What is this research all about?" Lindsay told her, then she exclaimed loudly, "The more reason for you to stay here. You could begin by speaking with the four of us, and then we'll introduce you to some ladies in church who also came here as mail-order brides." Abby looked pleased with herself. "So, no more mention of you leaving, and if anyone tries to say otherwise, let me know and I'll deal with them." "You're so kind, Abby." "No, Lindsay. You've been mistreated by a member of this family, and we're going to do all we can to make sure you're all right. When your research is done, only then can you make other arrangements. But for now, consider this to be your home." "I wouldn't go in there just yet," Jed told Judah, who was walking towards the house. Jed was standing on the kitchen porch and came down the steps as he spoke. "Keep out of the house for now, especially the kitchen area." "Why shouldn't I go in?" "It's nearly breakfast time, and Abby doesn't like people coming in late for meals." "Trust me, you don't want to go in there right now, Judah." Jed took his brother's hand. Judah allowed himself to be pulled away from the house, and they walked towards the new barn that Jed was building. They were expecting a few new cows, and Abby also wanted to keep a few chickens. A lot of changes were taking place on the farm. Abby is in a rage because Lindsay just told her that she wants to leave. "Let things settle down for a little bit before you go into the house. If I know my wife very well, you're in a lot of trouble, especially if Lindsay has told her that you refused to marry her." "I didn't refuse to marry her, I just changed my mind. That's all." "Are you even listening to yourself as you speak? What's the difference, Judah? Refusing to marry someone and changing your mind is one and the same thing, unless you're speaking a language that I don't understand. Yesterday, I didn't want to cause a scene because we were in the house, but now we're away from all that. Can you in all honesty tell me that you don't want to marry that lovely woman in there? I already said I didn't want to marry Lindsay because I'm not ready. Then why did you send for her to come to Woodland? Many people correspond with mail-order brides for a long while and only extend invitations when they are ready to receive them. Is it really fair for you to do this to that young lady in the house? It wasn't my intention to hurt her. But you clearly did. So what are you going to do about all this mess now? And don't tell me that you'll ask Lindsay to leave because Abby will probably slay all of us. I love my wife and I'm very happily married and you won't change that for me. Judah Rusher, get your mind in order and find a good solution to this mess you've made. But for goodness sake, stay out of Abby's way for as long as you can. It was quite obvious that Judah was avoiding her. But Lindsay refused to feel sorry for herself. She kept telling herself that it was a good thing Judah had rejected her because it gave her ample time to continue with her research. Just as Abby had said, she spoke to her other sisters-in-law, and they all agreed to be interviewed. It was 2 days before they were all ready at the same time, and now they were all headed to Beth and Joshua's house. It was Beth who had suggested the venue because they would experience the least disturbance there. Sophie's house was too far away in the bushes. Abby's always had people coming and going, and Kate's was a distance away on the other side of town. Then you can also taste my new cake, which I hope to take to church on Sunday for the bake sale. I'm hoping that because there are so many weddings happening every week in this town that I can start a small bakery before I get too tired to do much, she'd said, and the deal was sealed. Jeremiah and Josiah had so graciously agreed to babysit the 3 children, and once again, Lindsay was struck by the closeness that the family shared. What exactly do you want to know about us, frontier wives? Sophia asked as soon as they got there and Beth invited them to be seated. Tea was laid out on the dining table, and Abby did the honors of serving them all. Where would you like us to start? At least let the poor girl take her first sip of tea. Beth waddled into the room. She was about 3 months away from her second baby. Sophia also looked to be in the early stages of pregnancy. Lindsay wondered if Catherine, too, would soon be having her own baby. The Rusher family was growing, and not for the first time. Lindsay wished things had turned out differently between her and Judah, but she had interviews to conduct as she gathered her scattered thoughts together. What made you all decide to become mail-order brides? Lindsay asked. I spoke with a number of ladies on the train here and got varying reasons and responses. Some are mail-order brides by choice, while others were practically forced into it by circumstances or family. What are your own stories? Abby smiled. I was a widow and felt that after 2 years of mourning my husband, it was time to move on. Ben was a really loving man, and I knew that he wouldn't have wanted me to continue mourning him all my life. Had it been me who went first, I wouldn't have wanted Ben to remain single and lonely all his life. But you could have married someone back in the East, for I'm sure some man or men must have expressed the desire to marry you. What made you decide to come west? Yes, I could have remained at home and found someone else had I wanted to, but I couldn't bear to think that it might be someone who reminded me so strongly of Ben. She had a pensive look on her face. I loved my husband so much and was devastated when he died. I never thought I would ever fall in love again, but Jed proved me wrong. It's a different kind of love that we share, but it's so real. She spread her hands out. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. Lindsay nodded. Moving on with your life after losing a much-loved spouse is so hard. My own father mourned my mother for 15 years, and at one point I didn't think I would ever leave home. He was so vulnerable and sad that I worried so much about him and couldn't bear to leave him, not even to get married. But about 3 months ago, we had a long talk, and I made him see that our housekeeper was a good woman who would make him happy. Well, they're now married, and by the time I was leaving, he was ready to let me go and was moving on with his life. So yes, I totally understand that moving on takes a lot of courage, and I know your husband and his family are the more blessed for your decision. Thank you for saying that, but it took some time for all of us to learn how to live together. She said this with a smile. How was it for you as the wife of the eldest son? Very challenging, because Jed had somehow omitted to tell me that he had 6 brothers. I arrived here, and the shock of finding out that it wasn't just going to be me and Jed made me react in a very strong way. Oh, dear. Yes, and though the brothers were all hard workers, suddenly finding myself thrust in the center of their universe was quite daunting. We had to do a lot of adjustments and growing up before things settled down, and we began to enjoy a normal home. Now I can't imagine this home without the 7 of them. They sort of grew on me, and I like it very much. So at the time you got married to Jed, their parents were already dead? Yes, and they'd been in Woodland for only 5 years. Believe me, when Beth came along, it was a great relief because I finally had a sister that I could share the home with. They were silent for a moment, and then Sophia cleared her throat. May I go next? She held her hand up. Sure, everyone said. My own reason for becoming a mail-order bride or ending up as one was based on my coming to the West in search of my paternal grandmother. Mama remarried when I was 4, and for so many years, I felt that I wasn't accepted by my new family. It took my Indian grandmother, after I found her, to make me see that my own fears were stopping me from accepting to belong. She giggled. When I got here, I didn't immediately find my grandmother and stumbled into Jonathan's compound at the edge of the woods. For a few days, I stole from his traps and his house too. The poor man must have thought that spirits of the forest were visiting him when his food kept disappearing. The others joined in her laughter. I slept in his shed until I foolishly tried to jump over a hidden trap and got badly injured. Thank God Jonathan was at home and heard me screaming, or else I would have died in the woods, bleeding heavily from a wound in my leg. The long or short of the matter is that when I came out here, I wasn't intending to really find love, but it sort of just happened to me. Love found me, her features softened, and Lindsay wondered what it would feel like to love and be loved so wholeheartedly. At the time you got here, you already had 3 sisters to help you settle down, isn't it? Yes, Lindsay. Let's just say Abby did a good job of getting our husbands to grow up in so many ways. Or should I say become mature? She's actually more like a mother to us, the other 2 ladies nodded, than a sister. My husband once told me that at the time Abby arrived, they didn't know how to do chores or keep the house tidy. They would trudge into the house with mud, and after meals, would just leave everything for Abby to do. Lindsay turned to Abby. How did you deal with all that? The ladle? She covered her face with her hands and giggled. Can you imagine wrapping the knuckles of grown men to get them to do what you want? And then they liked arguing a lot. And then they liked arguing a lot. And somehow they learned how to calm down. She's being really modest, Beth said. But for Abby, I don't think any of us would have lived with our husbands for this long, or even married them in the first place. Our dear sister has done a good job of making our men into the kind of people who appreciate their wives. Good thing is that they readily admit their mistakes and even appreciate Abby so much. We all do. And the 4 ladies reached out their hands and formed a small circle. They truly belonged to this land and to each other, and Lindsay felt a lump in her throat. what she wouldn't give to become a part of such a loving sisterhood. She had to carry on with the interviews before she burst in tears. Kate, what's your story? Did you and your husband, John, is it? She nodded. Did you and John correspond for some time before you came out here? Kate shook her head. I also didn't come as a bride, but was accompanying my father on a fact-finding mission. He wanted to retire and had been told that Woodland is one of the best places on earth for that. And when we got here, I accidentally fell into the rusher's wagon and they brought me home, without knowing that I was in there. Of course, my father thought that I had been kidnapped and raised quite a ruckus, but all was sorted out eventually, Kate said. Poor John had to spend some time in jail and everyone was getting ready to hang him because they said he'd kidnapped me. She pointed at her leg. The first gift my husband made for me was this prosthetic leg. It was the most romantic thing because no one understood my need to have a leg that fit well. I knew right then that John was the man for me, and I didn't hesitate to say yes when he proposed. She had a dreamy look in her eyes. John Rusher was the first man who wasn't repulsed by the fact that I had only one leg. And it helped that he was so handsome too, so saying yes wasn't at all difficult for me. They laughed over the information cache, though Lindsay knew that they must have passed through some terrifying moments when all that happened. She found herself liking these women more and more because they'd faced various challenges and came out strong. There was one more to go, and everyone turned to Beth. I came out here as a reluctant mail-order bride because my father had done some business deal with Joshua Rafford and even paid him a hefty dowry. She twisted her lips. I came out here against my will. I guess the deal had already been sealed. I just had to accept it. Then, how did you end up being married to Joshua Rusher instead of Rafford? At the station, I didn't speak English or understand it well, so I asked someone if he knew Joshua Rafford. I don't know if it was my accent, but the gentleman pointed out Joshua Rusher to me. So I chased him down, nearly getting struck down by a wagon in the process. Talk about chasing after love, she said dryly, and they all laughed. When I caught up with him and told him that we were supposed to be getting married, he looked really surprised. That should have told me right then that I had the wrong groom, but I guess his looks dazzled me. She covered her face and blushed. He was also dressed simply in his everyday work clothes. Certainly not like a man who was about to walk to church for his wedding. But still, my mind refused to see all that. Well, we went to church and exchanged vows and went home. But it wasn't until a couple days later when Judah came home and did some translation for us that we realized that we had a major problem on our hands. I had married the wrong man. Oh my, Lindsay put a hand to her heart. What did your real fiancé do when he found out that you were married to someone else? At the time, I was already in love with my husband and didn't want to leave him, and this after just a few days. But Rafford came with his posse, if I can call them that, and camped outside the house. That was the same day that Abby gave birth to Jacob, and for a while, people had to stop fighting to let the new baby come into the world. Was anyone hauled off to jail? No. When Rafford realized that I have a mouth on me and know how to use it, he said he didn't want such a wife and then left. That's how I got married to the love of my life. You're all very brave, and Beth, I'm quite impressed at how fast you learned English and can now speak it so well. Lindsay was quite amazed at the stories she heard. No wonder that the West is fast expanding and so prosperous. And that's because of women like you who are so selfless and courageous. Men are hard workers, but they need good women beside them. We hope our stories have helped. More than I could have imagined, Beth. And thank you for welcoming me into your home." Lindsay shut her notebook. "I'd like to visit one of the newspaper offices so I can speak to someone about how men place adverts for brides. It would be interesting to also find out if there are any women out here in the West searching for husbands back east. That would also make for interesting reading. Hugo Grant is the best man to talk to." And Sophia winked. "He's very handsome and tall and very much single." "Sophia!" her sisters gasped. "What?" She didn't look at all embarrassed. It's obvious that Judah has blinders on and refuses to see that Lindsay is right for him. Lindsay deserves to meet a good man, and I believe that Hugo is one such person. He will make a good husband for you, Lindsay." "And how would you know that?" Abby demanded. "Because I've heard ladies in church say so. Many mamas wish they still had daughters of marriageable age so they could become Hugo's mothers, by marriage. He's very kind and generous. That alone doesn't make a man a good husband. Many seemingly kind and generous men often turn out to be quite problematic." "That's for Lindsay to decide," Sophia insisted. "She's a beautiful woman who deserves a good man." Ladies, Lindsay laughingly held her right hand up. "I'm right here." Judah doesn't want to marry her for his own silly reasons, but Lindsay will make someone a good wife. This from Beth, who no longer struggled so much with long sentences. When he was teaching me English, I thought he was a very romantic and accepting man. She twisted her lips. Turns out I was wrong. She muttered some French words, and Abby rolled her eyes. "Beth, whatever you said, none of us understood it." "I was just venting my anger at my brother-in-law for not seeing all this beauty before him. But never mind, I have some French phrases that I'd like to unleash on him." After a few more minutes of sharing and good-natured arguing, Kate announced that she had to go back home. "John was away but returning today, and I'd like to be there when he arrives back home. I also need to get some things from the mercantile and could take you to Hugo's newspaper office," she told Lindsay. "I'd be very grateful for that." As she rode beside Abby and Kate, Lindsay hoped her face didn't show her despair or sadness. Abby had decided to take the wagon instead of the more comfortable buggy because of the amount of goods she needed to bring back home. The early afternoon wind felt good in her hair, and she was tempted to just lay her head back and let herself go. She should have been enjoying her life and not running around gathering more information for her father's book. But she had to be with the fact that she was making good progress. Even though she'd been here for a few days now, writing to her father and Peaches seemed like quite a daunting task. What was there to write about? The fact that the man she came to get married to had rejected her. "Don't look so dejected," Kate said softly, touching her arm. "Jed will soon make Judah see the error of his ways, and then he will come running to marry you." Lindsay shook her head. "I would rather that a man marry me because he's chosen to do so out of the love he feels for me and not because his brother has made him do it. The sting of rejection hurts, but I'll be all right, and thank you for being so concerned." They chatted about other things when it became evident that the topic was one Lindsay didn't want to continue with. "Well, here we are now," Abby announced as she pulled up outside the Woodland Herald, the newspaper run by Hugo Grant. Lindsay was surprised that they'd arrived so fast. On the day Judah took her home, the journey had seemed so long. "Lindsay, just tell Hugo that we sent you and he'll give you all the information you need. I have to run Kate home, and then I'll be back." "I can't thank you enough for doing this for me." Lindsay carefully got down from the wagon and waved at them as they left. "See you soon." Lindsay noticed one or two men looking at her with a lot of interest, and one even waved and seemed like he wanted to come over. She blushed, then hurried into the newspaper office. Chapter 7. Blast of Reality. Hugo Grant turned out to be a very interesting man, and when he heard that it was Abby Rusher who'd recommended that Lindsay come to see him, he was very happy. The Rushers are one of the first families that I made friends with when I arrived in Woodland 2 years ago. Why? Even Judah Rusher recently placed an advert for a mail-order bride in my journal, and I think he will be getting lucky soon. The other day when I saw him at the train station, I thought he was waiting for his bride, but apparently I was wrong. Anyway, welcome to my shop. It's good to be here. Thank you. Lindsay didn't want the subject of Judah coming up, and she prayed that Hugo wouldn't dwell on it. Were you working for a newspaper back in the East? Lindsay shook her head and laughed softly. Nothing like that, sir. Please call me Hugo. Referring to me as sir makes me feel really old, and yet we're so close in age. Then I'll also ask you to call me Lindsay. Very well then, Lindsay. You were telling me about your life back in the East. Yes. I come from New Hampshire, a small village called Raven Cove. I was a teacher, but after my father retired, he wanted to write a book on mail-order brides, so I've been helping him with the research. What brought you out here? More research on mail-order brides? You could say that, she replied, not wanting to divulge the real reason she'd come to Woodland. What I'd like to find out is how your clients place their adverts in the papers and how they're able to be accessed by thousands of women in the East. Well, as you know, these days, anyone can place their own advertisements in the newspapers so they can find themselves brides or grooms. But more and more people have realized that it's very easy to get scammed and lose money and time. So how does advertising with the Woodland Herald ensure that those who come to you don't get scammed? Nothing is foolproof, but our adverts always come with a warning not to send money unless one is absolutely sure that the person they're sending it to actually exists. I have a good following in the eastern towns of America, and that's how my adverts get to so many people. He grinned at her, and she wished she could be attracted to him. I can actually boast that in the past year alone, I was responsible for over 20 couples coming together, so you could call me a matchmaker of sorts. How can one know for sure that they're not being scammed on either side? On the train here, I spoke with a few women who were doing the journey west, not for the first time. One lady actually said it was her 4th trip because each time she arrived at her destination, it was to find that her intended groom wasn't who he'd presented himself to be. That's rather unfortunate, but it happens a lot. Another lady told me that she was going west after joining a bridal agency in Springville, Ohio. Do you think that bridal agencies will soon take over what newspaper advertising has been doing? Each matchmaking medium, whether newspaper adverts or bridal agencies, have their own part to play. There are those who would never use agencies while other people would never trust newspaper advertisements. Different strokes for different folk. But in the end, I like to think that most people at least finally find love and are happy. It's my belief that if a person goes into this whole thing of finding a life partner with their eyes wide open and at first put aside all dreamy and romantic notions, then mail-order brides are going to last long after you and I leave this earth. But isn't romance supposed to be a part of finding love and all? Aren't people allowed to dream anymore? Hugo chuckled softly. Lindsay, romance is as old as the earth, but how people go about it is what's wrong. I believe that what a person or people ought to do first is to accept whoever the Lord brings their way. There's no ugly person ever born by a woman because my Bible keeps reminding me that we are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's own image. For a person to look at another and consider them ugly is really wrong because first it's childish and then even sinful. It's like saying our Lord didn't know what he was doing when he created a certain person whose looks don't meet our expectations. The Creator himself molded the person in their mother's womb and saw that they were beautiful. Why should another person think he or she knows better than the Creator? That's really profound and very sweet, especially coming from a man. Lindsay twisted her lips. Most men I know like to see the beauty on the outside and judge a woman by that, which I say is foolishness. Then you're a very different kind of man. I like to believe that I'm different from my peers. If we accept people just as they are, we then learn to appreciate them for their real value and not just fickle things like how they look or dress. After appreciation then comes respect for the person, which in turn becomes like, and eventually, love. That's the journey that I'd personally like to take when it comes to love. So are you telling me that if you advertised for a bride and a woman whose looks are plain comes to you, then you'll accept her? A plain woman, according to me, is one who is selfish within and only thinks of herself. She loves only the person she sees in the mirror, and everything becomes all about her and her own selfish needs and desires. But a woman who's as loving, kind, and of a gentle spirit no matter how she looks, that's a beautiful woman. But one of the ladies on the train told me that she had been rejected by the man who was supposed to marry her because he said she wasn't beautiful enough. So she had to go back home, and this was her second attempt. She got off the train somewhere after Salt Lake City, and I actually saw her with a gentleman who welcomed her. I wish to see the end of that particular story. But I guess I'll have to write and ask her how things are going on. What struck me was that the man looked like he was really happy to have her. Sometimes the first time doesn't work out, but eventually a lady or a man will find their true love. Prayer is also what really helps in this situation. Judah was in town on his way to the law offices when he saw Abby and Kate dropping Lindsay off at the newspaper office. He was really curious as to what she was doing there and decided to go and find out, but without her being aware of what he was doing. Was she trying to place an advertisement so she could find herself another husband, or was it solely for the research she'd mentioned? He didn't understand why he wanted to know so much about the woman that he had rejected and had practically ignored ever since she got here. Then he shrugged. It would be good to know what she was up to, he told himself. There was a small alley on one side of the newspaper office. As soon as Abby drove away in the wagon and he was sure no one was looking at him, he slipped into it and listened to the conversation going on inside. Well, thank you so much for the insight that you've given me on this whole matter of brides coming to the West, Lindsay said much later. Lindsay, anytime you need some more information, you're free to come and see me. If anything, I could do with an assistant as intelligent as you. So if you're looking for a job, look no further. Lindsay was quite surprised that she'd been speaking with Hugo for close to 2 hours. They had covered many topics including the changing landscape of the West, America's impact overseas, and then dwelt on Woodland. They also discussed how Hugo could increase sales and what other articles would appeal to a wide variety of readers. She didn't know how time had flown past so fast. I'm sorry. She stood up and smiled self-consciously. I've taken up so much of your time, and yet you seem to be very busy when I came in. I hope I haven't stopped the production of the magazine. May I please take my leave now? Nonsense. It was a pleasure having you here. And no, you haven't stopped production of the paper. This is a weekly journal, and I have 2 days to get it done and ready. He waved a dismissive hand. Like Sophia had said, Hugo was tall and very handsome. Besides, you are such good company and remind me so much of my mother. He noticed the look on her face and hastily reassured her. Not in any offensive way, but that you're a strong and really determined woman, and I admire you a lot. That sounds like an honor. Indeed it is. Mama came to America first as a mail-order bride, but her first husband was killed just a few days after they got married. After almost a year, she met my father when she returned to Germany for a visit. Having fallen in love with America, she convinced him to come back, and they settled in San Francisco. But when the chance to open and run a newspaper arose, Papa came up here and the Woodland Herald was born. Are your parents still alive? Yes, both of them, but are living in San Francisco where they run another, smaller paper. This is all mine now. The warm, sunny beaches kept drawing my dear father back to San Francisco, so he let me take this one over. He smiled at her. You're a very smart woman, and thank you for the ideas on how to improve the paper. And as I said, if you ever need a job, all you have to do is walk in, and I'll hire you on the spot. Thank you. It felt good to be appreciated. I'll keep that in mind once I'm done with this research work for my father. The door opened and Abby walked in. It was clear that she and Hugo were old friends, and after exchanging some light banter, she turned to Lindsay, ready to go. I'm sorry for keeping you waiting. No, you didn't. Abby shook her head. Kate had something to show me back at her house, and then I had all that shopping to do. I actually thought that I was the one keeping you. We're all done here, but Hugo has kindly invited me to come back any time I need more information from him. Of course, and I offered her a job. Abby, would you convince Lindsay to come and work for me, please? Abby laughed. I wish I could do that so that we keep her right here in Woodland, but she's determined to work on her research first. But have no fear, I'll keep throwing nice words her way so she will consider your offer to work for you. People, I'm standing right here, Lindsay protested. Why did people see the need to discuss her as if she wasn't present? Please forgive us if we have offended you in any way. Hugo took her hand playfully. It's just that you're such an exceptional person, and I really enjoyed your company. Hugo, thank you for taking care of Lindsay, but we have to leave now. Yes, indeed, and thank you for spending time with me, Lindsay. He walked them to the wagon, and after ensuring that they were seated, he waved as they drove away and returned to his office. On the way home, Lindsay noticed that Abby kept casting furtive glances her way and smiled. Abby, you look like you'd like to ask me something. Speak up. Her companion laughed. Was I being that obvious? Something like that. So what did you think of Hugo Grant? Lindsay had to choose her words carefully. Much as she was annoyed with Judah Rusher for having brought her all this way only to reject her, she couldn't get him out of her mind. Besides that, Abby was his sister by marriage, and it wouldn't do to speak badly about him or to even hint at the fact that she could move on if she so desired. Hugo was indeed single, and she had noticed that he seemed interested in her but was too much of a gentleman to come out and say it. Maybe that was the reason he'd invited her to come back, but she didn't want to jump to any conclusions. He might just be showing her kindness. Hugo seems nice enough, she said cautiously, and was surprised when Abby burst out laughing. Did I say something wrong? No, but wait until the girls hear of this. Hear of what? Lindsay was puzzled. You've also been bitten by the Rusher bug. Lindsay felt herself blushing. Don't worry. The girls won't think any less of you. There's something about these Rusher men that gets women all confused, me included. They are good men, and Judah is no exception. A little bit confused right now, but he's got a good heart." Lindsay doubted it, but kept her thoughts to herself. As they had left the newspaper offices, she was sure she'd seen Judah, and that he'd also noticed them, but then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. That didn't seem like a man who would ever change his mind about her. And it hurt a lot, but she didn't want to dwell on that. The conversation he'd overheard at the newspaper office bothered him a lot. Was he a fickle man like his brother had said? Hugo and Lindsay had talked for a long time, and the conversation was very interesting. They seemed to have so much in common, and it was obvious the man found her attractive. Judah didn't know why that should make him feel angry. He was especially disturbed by Hugo's words. For a person to look at another and consider them ugly is really wrong, because first it's childish, and then even sinful. It's like saying our Lord didn't know what he was doing when he created a certain person whose looks don't meet our expectations. The Creator himself molded the person in their mother's womb and saw that they were beautiful. Why should another person think he or she knows better than the Creator? He's told his brothers that Lindsay wasn't beautiful. Wasn't that judging her based on her looks? Hugo's words really haunted him. 2 days later, as he was helping Joshua mend the fence behind the barn, he heard laughter coming from Beth's house. It was Lindsay, and he knew that she was spending time with his sister-in-law because she wanted to learn some French. She was also teaching Beth more of the English language, and being a teacher, was making quite good progress. Lindsay was a fast learner, and he'd heard her conversing with Beth in French. Being an eager student, she spent every free moment over at Beth and Joshua's house. She didn't seem like she was in a hurry to leave, and when he'd asked Abby how long she intended to stay, had received a rebuke that still rang in his ears. "Lindsay is no longer your concern or business, so keep your questions to yourself," she'd said. "I invited her to stay for as long as she wants, and since no one else is complaining, I don't see how that's your problem at all." He'd left the house hastily and was careful about what he said about Lindsay, especially around Abby. "Sounds like some people are having fun," Joshua commented in his quiet voice, bringing his attention back to the present. Judah grunted and picked up another piece of wood to fasten onto the fence. One of their very rambunctious calves had discovered that this part of the fence wasn't as strong as the rest and kept butting it and escaping from the enclosure. It was the part of the fence that was closest to the house that Joshua had built for his wife. "What's wrong with you?" "What?" Judah paused long enough to glare at his brother. Joshua ignored the look. That woman in there has been turning quite a few heads in town, and it won't be long before some man comes knocking at Abby's door and asking for her hand in marriage. Given that it was Joshua telling him this, Judah paid attention. From experience over the years, this particular brother never said anything unless he was absolutely sure that it was true. He wasn't a gossip and loudmouth like Jeremiah. "What have you heard?" Joshua merely shrugged and went on mending his part of the fence. Again, from experience, Judah knew that he would get nothing more from his brother once he shut up. It troubled him that Joshua's words disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Lindsay had been here for close to 2 weeks, and in that short time, she'd made a number of trips into town and returned looking really happy. What was going on? Jeremiah or Josiah were always on hand to drive her there in the buggy or the wagon, but they always returned soon after, saying she would find her own way back. What was worse, Hugo Grant had been the one to bring her back home on all those trips. They seemed to get on very well, and lately, Judah had wondered why they spent so much time together. And then the conversation he'd overheard. He had said that Lindsay wasn't beautiful, and that was why he wasn't ready to marry her, but from the way Hugo spoke, the man wasn't interested in facial beauty. That made him feel even worse for, at the back of his mind, he knew that Hugo was right. A good woman wasn't one who necessarily had the looks that would turn heads, but the condition of her heart was important too. Jeremiah was the loud mouth and gossip of the family. He seemed to know everything that went on in and around Woodland, and if there was anyone who knew what was going on, Judah was sure it was him. He needed to speak with his brother and find out what other people were saying around town. Chapter 8. The Bitter Truth. All during dinner that evening, Judah kept replaying Joshua's comment in his mind. His thoughts were so focused on what Joshua had said, that Lindsay was turning a lot of heads in Woodland, that he hardly paid attention to what everyone else was discussing. He couldn't understand why the thought of Lindsay with another man unnerved him. Hadn't he been the one who rejected her in the first place? So why did he suddenly feel like riding into town and challenging Hugo Grant to a fight? Had they been in England, he would have challenged the man to a duel. He was confident that he would win in any physical altercation they got into, given that Hugo was what McGraw would have termed as a suit and tie man. He automatically reached for a bun, but when he brought it up to his lips and realized that it was one of Amy's chew toys, his face creased in a scowl. "Don't you dare darken my dinner table with that ugly scowl, Judah Rusher," Abby warned, holding her hand out for the toy. From the cheeky look on Jeremiah's face, it was clear who had played the prank on him. He wanted to reach across the table and haul his brother over to his side and give him a good beating, but Abby's sharp eyes were still on him. She'd reinforced the table manners their mother had taught them, and one of the house rules was that no one sat down to dinner with anger in their hearts. "Spit out what's troubling you," she said. "Nothing," he mumbled sulkily. "Then finish your dinner and go help Lindsay with the dishes." "Yes, ma'am," and he bent down to eat whatever was left on his plate. Lindsay wasn't at the table, and he realized that she must have finished eating ages ago. Lindsay stood at the kitchen sink, both hands covered in soap suds. Her thoughts were far away, and she didn't even hear the door open to admit Judah into the kitchen. She was thinking about him and how his presence at the dining table had made her feel almost breathless. Why did he continue to affect her so much? And he'd hardly spoken since the day he brought her home. Spending a lot of time with Hugo at the newspaper office was supposed to have helped her get over Judah, but it only seemed to be making things worse. Hugo was a good man and had tried to make their relationship more than it was, but he just couldn't compare to Judah. "I'm already taken," she told him as gently as possible, not wanting to lose him as a friend. He was helping her a lot, and she was about to send the first batch of information off to her father. "What a pity, for you're a very beautiful woman. I wish I had known you first, but, well, that's just the way life is, I guess. And you truly are a good man, too. If you don't mind my being so bold, would you like to meet my sister?" "You mean there's another beautiful Neuwirth woman in the world?" "Yes," she'd replied, and even showed him a picture of Peaches, becoming really happy when he seemed to shift his attention from her and to her stepsister. "When can I get to meet her?" And so had began their correspondence, or rather, he'd written his first letter to Peaches and was waiting for a response from her. Lindsay had also written and spoken of Hugo in glowing terms, hoping Peaches would give the man a chance. "Where do I place these?" Judah's voice cut into her thoughts, and she froze for a moment. Judah couldn't believe that he'd been standing at the door for close to 2 or so minutes, but Lindsay hadn't noticed him at all. She'd seemed lost in her own world, and he wondered if she was thinking about Hugo and a future with him. The idea put an unpleasant taste in his mouth, and his words came out harsher than he'd intended. "Place them on the table," Lindsay said without turning around. "You could at least look at me when talking to me." His voice was rough. "One would think my presence disturbs you." Lindsay's lips tightened, and she spun around to give him what she hoped was her most annoyed look. "What is it you want from me, Judah Rusher? You made it clear from the moment I set foot in Woodland that you weren't interested in me, and I'm not the kind of woman you were looking for. I left you alone, and I'm busy minding my own business. Why are you bothering me now? I said you should place the dishes on the table, and a gentleman would have done so, and left." She didn't realize her voice had risen until Jed stepped into the kitchen. His gaze moved from one to the other. "Is everything all right in here?" "No, it isn't." She took the apron off and flung it on top of the small kitchen table. "Tell your brother to stay out of my way." "Excuse me," she said between clenched teeth, and left the kitchen. Judah held his hands up. "I didn't do anything, honest." "Then why is Lindsay so upset?" "Honestly, Judah, leave the girl alone because you made it obvious that she's not suitable for you. With your own lips, you said she wasn't beautiful enough. What is it you want now? Just leave her alone and let her get on with her life." "And what if I don't?" His tone was challenging as he walked out of the house through the back door, leaving his brother staring at him with a thoughtful look in his eyes. After walking out on Jed, Judah found himself wandering towards Sophia and Jonathan's home. He was still hungry, and dinner had been very strenuous. Sitting at the same table with Lindsay was giving him more trouble than he'd expected, especially since she barely acknowledged his presence. She joked and laughed with his brothers and Abby, and the little ones seemed to love her so much. Maybe it was because she was a teacher that made her so good with children, but Judah had even found himself thinking that she would be a wonderful mother. Jonathan was cleaning his rifles on the porch when Judah strayed into his homestead. "What brings you out here? And I know it's dinner time at Abby's house. She doesn't let anyone miss their meals, so I'm guessing that there's been some kind of trouble out there." "I don't know what you mean." Judah sat on the top step of the porch and gazed into the distance. There was still some light by which he could see, and he noticed some of the laborers rounding up the calves in one paddock. At least they weren't losing as many animals as before, because their fences were stronger now. Thanks to John and his many inventions, and the money they now had to make things all right on the farm, life had really changed for them since they first arrived in Woodland, and they could almost be termed as a prosperous family now. There was always enough to eat and plenty more to spare. They were also getting more into ranching, and so far things were balancing out quite well. Money was good, Judah thought, for it enabled a person to do so much. So why was he so miserable? "You look like you could use a friend." Jonathan came and sat down beside him. "What troubles you?" Judah sighed, and then turned to his brother. "Jonathan, do you think I'm a fickle person? Please be honest with me. I'm very careful about how I respond to questions whose context I don't know." "Why would you ask me that?" "Jed said I was fickle." "Why?" "Because I refused to marry Lindsay." "Did you give him good reasons as to why you changed your mind when you'd invited the poor woman to come all this way?" Judah felt his neck getting hot when his brother continued staring at him. "Well, when Lindsay stepped off the train, she wasn't what I was expecting." "And what were you expecting?" "Look at Abby, Beth, Sophia, Kate. What about your sisters-in-law? They're all so dazzling. And you want to say that Lindsay isn't?" Before today, Judah might have answered immediately, but his brother's question made him pause. Lindsay was beautiful. That much he could finally admit. Then what was wrong with him before that he'd rejected her? At the time, I didn't think so, was all he said. What changed your mind then? He shook his head. I honestly don't know, Jonathan. What was I thinking back then? Or perhaps it's because you've realized that you're not the only fish in this pond that's called Woodland. Jeremiah talks, and he's been saying some interesting things. Like what? Like how Lindsay is now the talk of Woodland. Apparently someone found out that you rejected her, and I'm almost certain our big-mouthed little brother was the one who let that out. Now I hear that men from all over are trying to gather courage to come and pay their respects to her, not to mention that she's been spending a lot of time with Hugo Grant, and they were even seen having a picnic together in the park a few days ago. According to Josiah, they seemed really happy together, and Hugo was taking very good care of Lindsay, treating her just like any woman expects to be treated. Love is growing between those two, and I wouldn't be surprised if they shortly announce their wedding. Jonathan, what do I do? Judah's voice was a hoarse whisper. What do you do about what? The girl isn't what you wanted, and she's moved on. You would do well to also move on and not stir up any trouble. Judah, let it go and let the poor girl find some love and happiness which you weren't ready to give. He stood up. It's getting rather chilly out here. Would you like to come in? Sophia was setting the table and dinner should be served by now. Judah found that he'd lost his appetite after all, and shook his head. Thanks, but I already ate something at Abby's place. Pass my love and regards to Sophia, and he left without a backward glance. After Lindsay left the kitchen, she rushed up the stairs to her bedroom and sat down on the bed, breathing heavily. She had to leave this house before Judah drove her out of her mind. She was in love with him, and it was affecting her too much, which wasn't fair to her hosts. The door opened and Abby slipped into the room. Are you all right, Lindsay? No, she shook her head. Abby, please allow me to leave tomorrow. I will find somewhere to stay in town as I continue with my research. We've been through this before, and I told you that you're not going anywhere but will stay here with us. I thought you wouldn't want me here after the fight I just had with Judah. Abby smiled. My brother-in-law has things to work out, and that shouldn't bother you at all. He's a grown-up and has to learn how to deal with his emotions. I was the one who became emotional and started shouting at him, she said with a small laugh. I don't know why I let him get to me, but I'm glad Jed walked into the kitchen, or else I might have hurled something at him. Lindsay, it's because you're in love and don't know what to do with all the emotions within you. She shook her head. I can't be in love with a man who rejected me. He humiliated me before his family, and I know that I've been pretending to be strong, but I can't do it anymore, Abby. Maybe leaving is the best thing for me to do. Sleep on it and you'll feel better in the morning. One thing I have learned is never to make any important decisions when I'm upset. Just know that we're all praying for you, and Judah and all will be well. Chapter 9. Misinformation. Jeremiah could barely contain his excitement as he rode up to the house, jumped off his horse, and ran up the porch steps. Bursting into the house, he caught everyone by surprise. Have you heard? He looked at Jed, who was trying to rock Amy to sleep. Sorry, his voice dropped to a whisper. Have you all heard? Heard what? Abby, who was just bringing Amy's bottle in, stopped and observed her brother-in-law. Hugo just announced that he's getting married. I was at the Mercantile when Monroe was congratulating him. He was looking at Judah as he said this. The announcement is being posted in church even as we speak, and in the next few days, be ready to receive your invitations." He sniffed. "Something sure smells good. Is lunch nearly ready, Abby?" "Jeremiah Rusher, you can't come in with that important announcement and then just start asking for food. Now tell me everything." Hugo and Lindsay are in love. Lindsay and Hugo are about to get married. Lindsay and Hugo will then live happily ever after. Is that good enough for you, Sister Abby? Really? Are you sure about what you're saying, Jeremiah? Hugo was in the store telling Monroe about his upcoming nuptials. Abby looked excited, and Judah wondered why that bothered him. His family all seemed happy that Lindsay had moved on, and it made him feel betrayed. They should be on his side working with him to get her back, and not celebrating that she had found someone else. And Hugo Grant, for that matter. He'd placed his advert in Hugo's paper, for crying out loud, and the two of them were no doubt laughing behind his back. Yes, Abby, and Lindsay was by his side. They looked so happy and were there together to select lace for the wedding gown. Are you trying to tell me that Hugo has proposed to our Lindsay and she said yes? Josiah clapped his hands happily, one eye on Judah. Good for her. I always knew that Lindsay would eventually find a good man, and it's finally happening for her. I'm not trying to say anything, Josiah. I'm stating the obvious. Hugo and Lindsay are about to tie the knot. Jeremiah ignored the sharp look Jed threw him. Those two have been spending a lot of time together, and it was inevitable that they end up together. I said it. Some man would snap up Lindsay and run away with her. He made a whooping sound, raising his hands in the air and clapping. He startled Amy, who whimpered, but her father managed to calm her down and back to sleep while sending Jeremiah a warning look. Did you speak with either of them? This from Abby, who had sat down next to her husband, irritating Judah further. Couldn't she just let it go? Not really. But I think Lindsay will make the announcement once she gets here. This is so wonderful, another wedding in the family in just a few weeks. Okay, Lindsay may not be family, but she sure feels like she belongs with us. It's a real pity that someone didn't notice this sooner, or else it would be we Rushers celebrating a new sister. But she's... Put that down at once. Jed's harsh tone made Jeremiah falter. Then he realized that it wasn't him being addressed. Go and cool your heels off in the barn, and don't return until you're ready to behave like a civilized man and not a juvenile delinquent. Jed told Judah. Judah cast the thick book he'd been about to hurl across the room at his brother down on the table and walked out of the house, barely restraining himself from slamming the front door. What did I say? Jeremiah sounded bewildered, but Judah wasn't buying any of that innocent act. For days now, his younger brothers had been goading him into doing something stupid and had nearly succeeded. Judah wasn't a violent man, but lately he'd began wondering if perhaps the vice had lain hidden within him all these years. Noticing Jeremiah's untethered horse grazing on the front lawn, he didn't think twice, but was on it and off like a shot. So Hugo Grant thought he could move in and encroach on his woman. Well, he had crossed the line too far this time, and it was time to put an end to all the foolishness. Lindsay Neuwirth was his, and no other man would take her away from him. Judah wasn't even aware that he was practically flying and didn't even notice when he passed Jonathan driving the family buggy back home. Sophia and Lindsay were with him and stared at his fast disappearing back in astonishment. Wasn't that Judah? Sophia asked her husband, who nodded. He seems to be in such a great hurry. You think? I wonder what's got him so rattled that he didn't even notice us. That's Judah for you. A hothead if you ask me, but I hope he doesn't land himself in any kind of trouble. He's been acting very strange lately, and I hope he's not going to cause any problems in town. Deputy Gaines would like nothing more than to get his hands on one of us. You gave him enough reason in the past. Okay, not all of you, Sophia laughed when she saw the expression on her husband's face. But you've got to admit that a lot of strange things have happened with you rushers in the past. The deputy is right to worry about you. Well, let's just hope that that particular rusher that rushed past us isn't going to get into trouble. A broken neck is more likely what he'll get if he doesn't slow down, Sophia said dryly, looking at Lindsay. Had you been at home, I would have said it was because you and he had clashed that he was flying off like that. But you weren't there, so what's his excuse? Lindsay really wanted an answer to that question, too. She turned to look back, but Judah had disappeared, leaving nothing but dust in his wake. Judah hopped off the horse and hurriedly secured it to the railing at the front of the store. He could see Hugo still in the store where he was talking and laughing with Monroe. His various purchases had been packed up and he seemed ready to leave. You think you're so clever, trying to steal my woman away from me? Judah burst into the store and charged right at Hugo. Before the astonished eyes of the store clerk and a few customers, Judah threw the first punch which Hugo deflected, but that only enraged him the more. With a loud cry, he threw one more, and within no time, the two men were on the floor exchanging blows. Will you stop this madness, both of you? Monroe tried to separate the two men and had to hastily jump out of the way when he realized they were too taken up in their fight to stop. The customers in the store were women, so he clearly wasn't going to be getting any help from them. Then, just as he was about to go and get his rifle and scare the two men into ending their fight, he saw a welcoming sight. The deputy sheriff was standing outside his window looking in, and he beckoned to him. So fierce was the tussle that neither of the two men heard the door opening, nor the hurried whispers of the store clerk to the deputy sheriff. You rusher boys are such troublemakers. Deputy Gaines grabbed Judah by the collar and hauled him to his feet. What kind of stupidity is this you're doing, and out here in a public place? What if you had injured one of these gentle ladies, huh? Or broken stuff in Monroe's store? Judah wasn't quite finished with Hugo, but the hand at the back of his neck wasn't letting go. It's off to jail with you. He glared at Hugo, who glared right back, and when it looked like they might run towards each other again, Monroe restrained Hugo while Gaines cuffed Judah and pushed him towards the door. As they stepped out of the store, Judah noticed the large crowd that seemed interested in what was going on. The deputy hadn't handcuffed Hugo, and he could see him gesturing to Monroe. "Idiot," he said under his breath, but the deputy sheriff heard him and cocked an eyebrow at him. "Do you want to say something, Judah Rusher? For I can allow you to speak all you want against Hugo, but I'll still have to book you for disturbing the peace." "I'm done," Judah muttered, not wanting to add more problems to those he already had. By now, someone was no doubt getting ready to rush out to the farm to let Jed and the others know that he'd been arrested. Of that he was sure. The last thing he wanted was one of his older brothers coming down here breathing fire, especially since he was the one who had initiated the fight. His face was swollen, the left eye was half shut, and his ribs felt like they'd been cracked. Hugo Grant had proven that he was no suit and tie wearing man, for he packed a mean punch. What was all that about, Judah? The deputy sheriff asked as soon as he got him down to the jail and booked him. The man had an intense glare that unnerved even the most hardened of criminals, and Judah wished he was anywhere else but here. "I thought Jed promised me that there would be no more trouble from you boys after the last time. The last time being when John was thrown in jail as a suspect after Catherine Langer's father thought she'd been kidnapped." Hugo started it. Not according to Monroe, who hailed me from the street. You two boys were too busy beating the living daylights out of each other to notice what was going on around you. Apparently, you charged at Hugo as soon as you entered the store. He started it, Judah insisted. How? By making moves on the woman I'm going to marry. Can't he find his own woman that he has to try and snatch mine away from me? What kind of a man does that? Deputy Gaines had an incredulous look on his face and then burst out laughing. You mean all this is because of a woman? She must really be special for you to get into a fight with someone. Of all your brothers, you're the last one that I would have expected to attack a defenseless man, and in public too. You know the law better than most in this town, and yet you're the one who has to go out and break it? Hugo is no defenseless man. He might have cracked a couple of my ribs with his blows. That would serve you right for attacking him. Did you just expect him to stand there and take your blows, son? Gaines chuckled and wrote something in the big book. You young people and your foolishness, why can't you ever solve matters amicably? Must you fight and break each other's bones in order to prove that you're men? He made a sound of disgust. In any case, I'll wait for one of your brothers to come and bail you out. But in the meantime, you might want to take a little bit of a rest after all that fighting. He chuckled softly, and Judah thought he heard him say something like dumb mule, but he couldn't be too sure. Well, he was dumb all right and didn't know what Jed or any of the others would say when they got here. It was Dale who saw Judah being taken to jail and rushed to the Rusher homestead to relay the news to them. With my own 2 eyes, that's what I saw. He told Jed and Abby, who looked at each other in surprise. It was just the 2 of them in the living room. Deputy Gaines wasn't showing any mercy, and I fear that your brother might be in for a really tough time. Do you know why Judah was arrested? Jed took his wife's hand. Oh, yes. I overheard Monroe telling some people that Judah just charged into the store and attacked Hugo Grant, accusing him of trying to steal his woman away. They got into a terrible fight, and if Monroe hadn't called in Gaines, I don't know if that store would still be standing. Jed, you need to go and bail him out of jail, Abby said. But her husband shook his head. That young pup needs to learn that actions have consequences. He refused to marry Lindsay when she arrived, and now that he finds out that she has moved on, he grows a hot head and goes to fight someone. No, my love. Let him sit in that jailhouse and think about his life. I won't go to town, at least not today. So you want him to spend a night in jail? Yes, indeed, and many more if possible. Perhaps that will teach him to always consider what he's doing before he rushes into things. Dale excused himself after a while, and just as he was leaving, Lindsay came into the living room. After acknowledging him, she greeted the couple and then sat down. Sophia, Jonathan, and I were just coming from town about an hour and a half ago, when we saw Judah practically flying to town on a horse. I would have come to let you know earlier about this, but I had to help Sophia finish up something at her house. Is he back yet? Who? Judah. Why? Abby looked really curious. Because there's something that I'd like to share with him. She had finally decided to let Judah know that she had forgiven him for rejecting her, and also asking for his forgiveness for the way she'd acted. A man had a right to make the choice of who to marry. Where can I find him? Sorry, he's been arrested for starting a fight at the Mercantile. According to Dale, he attacked Hugo Grant. Oh dear, she looked at Jed. Will you be going to bail him out? Not a chance of that happening today. And I think you need to know that he thinks you and Hugo are getting married. That's why he attacked the poor newspaper fellow. Oh dear," Lindsay repeated. Chapter 10. The Desperate Groom. "I'm so happy to see you all." Lindsay hugged her father, then Mabel and Peaches in that order as soon as they stepped off the train. "I couldn't believe it when Peaches told me that you were all coming for the wedding. We couldn't miss the grand wedding for anything." Mabel linked her hand with Lindsay's. "You're looking really well, and it's clear that you've been taken care of by someone who really values you." Lindsay laughed happily so her parents wouldn't find out that her heart was aching. "You also look so well, and especially Pa." "Mrs. Mabel, thank you so much." "No, my dear. Thank you for pushing this stubborn man in proposing. I began thinking that I would have to knock him over the head with a skillet and then carry him down the aisle myself." They all laughed, and Lindsay was pleased to see her father looking years younger than his actual age. True love really changes people, she thought. Just see how her own father and Mabel looked like a young, blissfully married couple. Even Peaches held her own, and Lindsay thought she looked stunning. "Welcome to Woodland, one of the most beautiful places on earth," Lindsay said softly. She could see Jeremiah and Josiah waving at her, and she waved back. "Come and meet some very special people who made me feel at home as soon as I got here." She led the way, still holding on to Mabel. The two had insisted on coming with her to the station when she told them that she was coming to meet her family. Jeremiah and Josiah straightened up when they saw the four approaching. "Jeremiah, Josiah, please meet my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Neuwirth, and my sister. Peaches, meet Jeremiah and Josiah Rusher. Meet Jeremiah and Josiah Rusher." Everyone shook hands all round, and then Lindsay noticed that there were tears in Mabel's eyes. "Is anything the matter?" she asked softly, drawing her aside. "You're such a delightful child." Mabel cupped her face in her palms and kissed her on the forehead. "You actually called me Ma, which means you're thinking of me in that way." "Ma sounds just right," Lindsay found herself saying, and she actually meant it. "You've been like a second mother to me all these years, and it's only right that I think of you that way. I hope you don't mind." "Mind? I love it. When your father asked me what I expected you to call me, I told him it didn't matter as long as you knew that you're loved. Lindsay, I can never take the place of your mother, but I'm so happy that you brought me and Anselm together. Even Peaches feels like we are now a complete family. It feels so good to know that I have you. Now, Ma, go and rescue those two boys from Pa or he'll talk their ears off." And Mabel went off laughing softly. Lindsay turned to Peaches and took her hand. "You look so radiant, dear sister. Are you nervous?" "A little bit, but I trust you, Lindsay." "Thank you for saying that. Now, we have to leave so we can make it to church in good time for the wedding. The bells have been tolling all day." "Why?" "It happens when there's a wedding and also for funerals. Though when it's a funeral, the bells toll for a short time only. It's such a joyous day today. Don't you think?" Judah sat with his head bowed, feeling the tears prickling at the back of his eyes. It was his fault that Lindsay was lost to him forever. Deputy Gaines had been by to let him know that he was going home to prepare for the wedding. Mighty fine fellow. This Hugo boy. He'd told Judah not more than an hour ago. He invited and then paid for the bride's parents to come all the way from New Hampshire. Now, if that's not love, then I don't know what is. His foolishness had pushed Lindsay into the arms of another man, and today was their wedding day. The church bells wouldn't stop tolling, and it was as if they were mocking him. He wished they would stop, but knew that they would only go silent after the last wedding of the day had been conducted. With the large number of young ladies arriving in Woodland weekly, the church had set aside 3 special days on which to conduct weddings. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays were now known as the wedding days of Woodland. Funerals and other ceremonies were pushed to the rest of the days of the week, except Sundays. Those who couldn't make it to church on those days for one reason or another were free to wait for the Justice of the Peace, who visited Woodland once a week on Wednesdays. But since most folk preferred a church wedding, they tried as much as possible to make sure those days found them ready. This was truly a terrible Thursday for him, for after this he wouldn't be seeing Lindsay again except as a married woman. Hugo Grant had won. He finally admitted that he was in love with Lindsay. But now it was too late. He had rejected and turned his back on her, and for 4 weeks, Hugo had been the shoulder that she had leaned on. Even his own family had treated her better than he had, and he had no one to blame except himself. Now they were getting married, and he was stuck in this jail. 4 days in jail had sobered him up, and his brother, when he'd come to see him on the second day, had told him that he didn't have any intentions of bailing him out anytime soon. I warned you not to get into trouble, but you wouldn't listen. Now this is the best place for you to be. Jed had said, unless some of you actually land in trouble and pay the consequences, you'll never learn. He'd not even complained, knowing that he deserved what was coming to him. Being in jail had given him enough time to think about his behavior, and he felt really remorseful. Lindsay deserved to move on with her life without any interruptions from him. He was the one who had said she wasn't beautiful and so had shunned her. Hugo Grant had seen the beauty within and without, and today she would be his wife. Judah had no doubt that Hugo would take really good care of Lindsay. Lord, please forgive me for saying Lindsay wasn't beautiful. I now see the error of my ways and ask for your mercy. Please give me peace so I can accept that Lindsay has moved on. Then, as an afterthought, give her a good life with her new husband. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. Like an idiot, he'd gone crazy and attacked Hugo, and now finally admitted why. Lindsay was in his heart to stay. Why hadn't he behaved like a civilized man and told her how he felt? While she might not have changed her mind about marrying Hugo, he would have at least got that off his chest. Now she would never know how he felt about her, but perhaps it was for the best. Soft footsteps, which he knew couldn't be a man's, were coming down the corridor. Wondering who it could be, he quickly wiped his eyes and waited for the person to appear. Good afternoon. Lindsay's soft voice made him think he was dreaming. She looked so beautiful, and he groaned inwardly. Why was he just noticing this about her? He was many days too late, and as his brother had so rightly pointed out, he would have to live with the consequences of his own actions. Shouldn't you be at the church getting married? He blurted out, and then turned red when she raised her eyebrows at him. I'm sorry, I had no right to ask you that. Well, I'll be leaving for the church shortly to get married, and I would like you to be there. Judah once again bowed his head and allowed the pain to wash over him. So she had come here just to mock him. But he didn't blame her, for he deserved this. Thank you for inviting me. He stood up and moved closer to the bars, holding onto them with a deadly grip till his fingers felt numb. Lindsay, I'm so sorry for the pain and shame I caused you. It was very selfish of me, and I now know that I was a fool to let you go. Judah, please let me finish. He wished he could hold her for just a moment, even though she would never be his. I've lost you because of my own stupidity, and even though it's too late now, I love you. That was why I went to fight Hugo when I found out that you and he were getting married. It nearly killed me. But Hugo has done the right thing, and since I don't deserve you, I'll wish you a happy wedding day and a wonderful life ahead. But please, don't expect me to come to your wedding." Lindsay nodded slightly, observed him for a while, and then turned and walked away without saying a word. Judah hit the bars with both fists, uncaring about the pain he was causing himself. "She's gone forever," he whispered and returned to the cot. When he heard footsteps once again, he stood up. Once again, it was Lindsay, and she had a package in her hands. "Deputy Gaines is coming to show you where you can change. I'll be expecting to see you at the church," and she turned and left. 3 days of stubble off, and a hurried bath in the deputy's quarters behind the jailhouse made Judah feel almost human again. He was glad for the change of clothing, surprised to find a new suit, shirt, tie, undergarments, and socks. His shoes had also been polished until they shone. What was going on? It felt more like he was going to be hanged than be freed. If someone gave him one last meal, he would know that his end had come. "Stop being so melodramatic," he told himself as he watched the officer opening the jail door for him. "You're now a free man, Judah Rusher." "Thank you, Deputy Gaines," he said when he was finally out of the cell. "Now don't go getting yourself in any more trouble. You're lucky that Hugo and the little lady that just left pleaded your case, or it would have been a long jail term for you. Like I said before, Hugo Grant is a good man and won't be pressing any charges against you. Now go straight to church where the good Reverend is waiting for you." Judah wanted to argue, but changed his mind when he saw the man's grim face. He stepped out of the jailhouse and was surprised to find all his 6 brothers waiting for him. The women of the family were conspicuously absent, and he guessed that they were probably in church standing with Lindsay as she got married to Hugo. "What are you all doing here?" he asked them without even greeting them. Had they also come to witness his humiliation? John chuckled. "You could at least greet us and thank us for getting you out of jail. Or would you rather that we left you in there?" That might have been preferable, because he didn't want to hear anyone saying how beautiful Lindsay looked on her wedding day. And she had glowed, wearing a beautiful lacy white long gown and hat that were clearly new. That was how a bride should look, and since she was one, it was only befitting. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, ignoring John's question. He wanted to go home and wallow in self-pity for the rest of the day, and probably his life too. "We're here to take you to church and make sure that you get there." Josiah had a cheeky gleam in his eyes that Judah wanted to wipe off with a blow. He actually clenched his fists, but his brother wisely stepped out of his way. "You just got out of jail and still want to start another fight right on the steps of the jailhouse." Josiah shook his head. "Tut, tut, 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 tut. Some people never learn." "Just shut up now, will you?" "Judah." Joshua held his shoulders. "Why are you in such a foul mood? Did 4 days behind bars do nothing for you? We're here to escort you to church so the good Reverend can drum some sense into your head. Perhaps after this, you'll learn how to watch your temper." "Well, you've wasted your time because I'm not going." "And why are you all dressed like you're attending a wedding?" "That's because we are. Now don't give us any trouble, but walk like a good man with us to church." "Jed, please don't waste your time asking me again because I'm not going." He intercepted a strange look between his brothers, and before he knew it, was held in a deathly grip with Jed and Joshua on either side of him. They were the only ones who were strong enough to contain him, and he tried to struggle, but they only held on even more firmly. "We knew you would say that, so we came prepared to drag you to church," Jeremiah said from behind him. They were making quite a scene, and Judah could see people watching them, some laughing and others wondering what was going on. When he realized that his brothers meant business, he stopped struggling. He was strong, but was no match for Jed and Joshua combined, so he allowed them to haul him to the church. His intention was to make them think he had given in, and as soon as he got the chance, would take off running. But they didn't stop until they had practically carried him up the steps and down the aisle to the altar. That's when he noticed that the church was full, and people were looking at him with amusement on their faces. He felt so exposed and wanted to scream, but tightened his lips. Now behave like a good boy. Jed straightened his tie, and that's when he noticed Hugo also at the altar dressed in a suit like his own. The two men glowered at each other, growling like two ferocious bulls about to charge at each other. Laughter rippled through the congregation. "What's this?" Judah turned angrily to Joshua, who merely shrugged. "What?" But he was cut off mid-sentence when the organist started playing the wedding march. How cruel could everyone be, making him watch right from the altar as Lindsay and Hugo got married? It was too much for him to handle, and he turned to walk down the aisle, regardless of what anyone would say, then saw a middle-aged man coming down the aisle. His face was beaming, and he looked really proud as he led two young ladies down the aisle, one of whom was Lindsay. Judah had never seen the other one before. What was going on? Like a meek lamb, he allowed Jed to lead him back to his place at the altar, and he stood there waiting to see what would happen next. As soon as the trio got to the altar, the Reverend stepped forward. "And now, will Hugo Grant and Judah Rusher please step forward to receive their brides?" "What?" Judah looked stunned. "The Reverend says you need to step forward and receive your bride, or don't you want to get married anymore?" Jeremiah's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, causing more laughter. Epilogue. "You should have seen your face when Papa handed me over to you," Lindsay said with a delightful giggle. "I hope the photographer captured the expression well for me. What a story to tell our grandchildren. How their grandfather had to be dragged to church for his own wedding. You're a very naughty woman, Lindsay Rusher." Judah still couldn't believe that the beautiful woman seated beside him was his wife. He was married to the love of his life, and as if to reassure himself that he wasn't dreaming, pulled her closer and she squealed. "Stop this at once, Judah Rusher. We're in our own house now, and you can squeal all you want. You've been a very cheeky and busy young lady, and for that, you must pay." Jed had offered them the use of one of the laborers' cabins, which was still empty, though they would have to make arrangements to move out since new workers were expected shortly. But Judah already had plans to build his new bride a home of her own. Lindsay deserved that much, especially because he wanted to start a family with her right away, and she was agreeable to that. You deserved to have your self-righteous cage rattled so you could finally face reality that I love you. When did you plan all this? I can't believe that you had me fooled right up to the moment your father handed you over to me at the altar. I was ready to murder Hugo Grant, but then I knew that it was all my fault, that I had lost you. From the moment I realized that Hugo was in love with my sister or what he'd seen of her in the photograph, I decided to let you believe that it was me. He was marrying, you was me, he was marrying. You see, I wanted to see if you were as indifferent to me as you made out. So you cruelly wanted to break my heart by making me believe you and he were getting married? It was the only way I could find out for sure if you loved me. What made you do it this way? It was something my stepmother said. She was in love with Papa for some time. But he was slow to realize what was going on. She was ready to clobber him over the head and carry him down the aisle and marry him. So I decided to do the same thing. It took some planning, but I had your brothers to help me, and even you have to admit that everything was done so perfectly. Lindsay, he took her hands in his. Will you ever forgive me for what I put you through all these days? Judah, please. I'm so ashamed of myself and how I behaved towards you. My mind was all mixed up, and when I saw you at the station, he bowed his head in shame. When I thought that I had lost you forever, his voice choked up. Lindsay touched his face and then raised his chin. I know, she said softly. She was amazed that she hadn't seen the love Judah had for her before. Somehow, it had been in his heart when he insisted on taking her home and in the following days. If he'd not had any feelings for her, he wouldn't have allowed her to continue staying at their home no matter what anyone said. It was no wonder then that she'd also started loving him and had chosen to stay at the Rusher farm. I know. You're a truly remarkable woman. Lindsay and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. No need for that, dear husband. We've given the good people of Woodland something to talk about in the coming days, she laughed. But more than that, I'm a very happy woman indeed. And so you should be, for you are loved so very much, Lindsay Rusher. I like the sound of my name on your lips, my love. And there it shall stay forever. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.